so I can join the fight. I will tell you the turns through the maze. Listen carefully.
Chapter 10. Sunset Death. Abeka woke up with a pounding headache. She was thirsty, and her belly was empty. The sun glared down at her through a gap in clouds that looked fat and heavy, likely to dump a load of rain at any time. She was on her side, in very tall grass, unable to move her arms and legs. For a long moment, she couldn't remember what happened. Her limbs appeared to be tied. But how? Why? When she remembered, she groaned more out of dismay than actual pain. There had been too many darts. Even aided by their spirit animals, the green cloaks could not avoid all of them. Eventually, the darts found unprotected skin, and the poison wound its way into their blood. Roland had gone down first, then Connor, both boys dropping heavily onto their backs, limbs splayed. Lishay had rushed to stand with Abeka, but she had been cut down mid-step. First, her eyes had rolled back into her skull, then her legs had folded underneath her, and finally, she had fallen face forward to the ground. Abeka had still worn the granite ram, and she used it to attempt a wild leap away. But even as she had passed over the wall of rhinos, a dart had hit the side of her neck. Uraza had yowled somewhere behind her. The world had contracted around her, fading into darkness first at the edges of her vision, then closing in around her, as though she was seeing through a long black tunnel. With the last of her strength, she called the leopard back into her tattoo. Uraza could not be harmed there, and might be able to help her when she woke up. If she woke up. Blinking up at the sky an unknown time later, she told herself to be grateful she was alive, even if she didn't know what she was going to do now. Her hands were tied with a leather cord. The bindings hobbling her ankles had the roughness of rope. She rolled over and found that Connor and Lishay were lying next to her. Both were awake, and both tied like her. Beyond Lishay, Roland was lying flat on his back. He was not tied up, but he wasn't moving. He looked very pale, very sick, or even, possibly, Roland!
He's alive, said Connor in response to her gasp. But he must be very sick. I'm worried about him.
He was looking a bit ill before, said Lishay. Or perhaps he has suffered a reaction to the poison. We have to help him, Abeka said, sitting up and inching awkwardly across the ground to try to get closer to him. Any sign of Tariq?
None at all,
said Connor. We won't see him, said Lishay softly, until he wants to be seen. Abeka looked around. The elephant grass was too tall to make out anything of their surroundings, apart from the tops of the usual jungle trees, some distance away. Is this the same clearing? No, said Lishay. We've been moved. We must have been carried here. What if they trade us to the conquerors for some kind of advantage? Abeka said. That is not the rider's way, said Lishay gloomily. We must face whatever justice they choose to mete out. There's usually a task or trial that we must complete, a very difficult one, in order to prove our innocence. If we can't, they will kill us. Somehow we must prevail.
But we haven't done anything wrong, said Connor.
If they were going to kill us, said Abeka, they would have done it already. It's hard to tell, said Lishay. I think we have been unconscious for 2 nights. Abeka shook her head in shock. 2 nights? No wonder she felt so parched.
Bring the prisoners.
The shout startled the Greencloaks. It was followed by the tramp of feet as 6 rhino riders came through the grass. 3 of them helped Lishay, Abeka, and Connor up, not very gently. The other 3 picked up Roland, who hung limply in their hold, head lolling from side to side. The clearing was much larger than where they had been captured. Right in the middle, sticking out of the elephant grass, was a tall rock that had been laboriously shaped to resemble a rhino. A heavily bearded man stood on the rock, dressed in the robe and turban of a rhino rider, but with a golden, curved rhino horn on a chain around his neck. Abeka looked at him, and then glanced around. There were ranks and ranks of rhino riders behind her, hundreds of them lined up, riders and rhinos watching the man on the rock, and the prisoners being herded over to him.
"I am Jodoboda,"
said the man, as Abeka and the others stood before the rock.
"Leader of the Tergesh, who you call Rhino Riders. Speak your names, and hear your doom."
"I am Lishay, a green cloak," said Lishay. "We come to—"
"Speak only your names!"
roared Jodoboda. "I am Abeka," said Abeka proudly, "of Okaihi."
"I am Connor," said Connor, "of nowhere in particular."
"And your companion?"
"He is Rolan," said Lishay. "He is sick. He needs—"
"Quiet!"
roared Jodoboda.
"From now on, only one of you may speak. I choose you."
He pointed at Connor. The boy gulped and looked at Lishay, who nodded her head slightly in encouragement.
We are green cloaks," said Connor in a hesitant voice. "We don't mean you, the rhino riders, any harm. We just need to find Dinesh, the elephant."
"We are the Tergesh. Did you know these lands were our lands?"
Yes, but we hoped we might, sneak across," said Connor.
Abeka tightly clenched her bound fists, but kept her face carefully impassive. She didn't want Jodoboda to see anything other than strength in her. Perhaps that would make up for the mess Connor was making.
"We're in a hurry, you see," Connor went on, "because the conquerors, the servants of the Devourer, they also want to find Dinesh. They're invading Ko-Kenzit, and they've already taken over Shin-Kau-Dai."
"We know this," said Jodoboda. "It is a small point in your favour that you are not conquerors."
"So, if it's all right with you," Connor continued, "we'd like permission to keep going, to find Dinesh. And we need help for Rolan. He's obviously sick."
"The Tergesh do not allow trespassers to travel in our lands unchecked," said Jodoboda. "We cannot allow you to wander aimlessly in your quest for Dinesh."
"Do you know where he is?" blurted out Connor.
"We know," said Jodoboda. "But why should I tell you? Why should I help you in any way? You will help us because a child is dying, and the Tergesh are honourable people, not monsters."
The crowd of rhino riders stirred. The voice had come from among their ranks. Jodoboda blinked. His thick whiskers bristled.
"Who said that?" he bellowed. "Come forward at once."
One turbaned figure stepped through the crowd to face the man on the rhino-shaped rock. He was robed from head to foot, and as he stepped free of the riders and joined the prisoners, he tossed his turban aside. Lishay's face lit up.
"Tariq!" Connor cried. "How did you find us?"
The fierce shriek of a falcon came from above as Essex plummeted down and swooped over his head, circling once around the clearing. With claws extended, she landed in the grass next to Rolan and stalked over to perch on the unconscious boy's chest.
"What is this?"
spluttered Jodoboda. He gestured with both hands, and the circle of riders closed in. Abeka's relief on seeing Tariq was tempered by the fact that now all of them were surrounded by rhino riders.
"We mean no disrespect,"
Tariq said with a low bow.
"Neither do we wish you any harm. Let us pass, and we guarantee no harm will come to you." "No harm? To me?"
Jodoboda tipped back his head and laughed uproariously, as though that was the funniest thing he had ever heard. His laughter choked into silence, as a slight figure rose up behind him and pressed a knife against his throat.
As my friend says, Malin told him, we offer our guarantee.
Abeka felt her eyes bulge in surprise.
Malin! Cried Connor. What? How? You mean no disrespect, you say?
Asked Jodabodda in a quiet voice. He seemed surprisingly calm with Malin's knife at his throat.
But you are standing on the rock of the people, which is the opposite of respectful. Climb down, and we will talk.
Malin hesitated, and for the first time caught sight of Rolan on the ground. Her eyes narrowed, and her knife moved close enough to Jodabodda's neck to give him a shave.
What have you done to Rolan? She cried.
Nothing, called out Abeka, her voice calm.
He's sick. The rhino riders didn't hurt him. Let's all talk peacefully.
Malin looked at Tariq, who nodded. She hesitated, then slowly put away her knife.
You see, we mean no harm,
said Tariq, as Malin climbed down and quickly knelt by Rolan's side, gingerly feeling his forehead with the back of her hand. She looked up at Connor and Abeka. Connor gave her a small wave, and Abeka nodded, but that was the extent of their reunion. Proper welcomes and explanations would have to wait until later.
I do see that now,
said Jodabodda, lightly rubbing his throat.
For this, and other reasons, I have decided that we will help you.
You'll take us to Dinesh and make Rolan well again? Asked Connor.
No. By ancient custom, we cannot do either of these things. Not yet. First, you must complete a task of my choosing. By completing it, you will earn the things you ask for.
This is your way of helping? Asked Malin, her hand going back to the hilt of her knife.
What task? Asked Connor, with an audible swallow. Jodabodda fingered his beard, deep-set eyes lingering on Rolan. The boy was very pale, and there were mottled patches of red on his face.
You must bring me 4 banana gourds from the deep swamp, he said. 1 for each of the fallen.
Banana gourds? Asked Connor. Is that all?
All? Do you think this task unworthy?
You're mocking us, said Malin.
I assure you that I am deadly serious, said Jodabodda sternly. Your friend has the sunset death. The cure is made from the seeds of the banana gourd. If he does not have it before nightfall tomorrow, he will die.
Everyone looked at Rolan. The red blotches on his face were the colour of sunset. There were small beads of sweat all over his skin as well, and his breathing was very shallow.
He's dying? Asked Malin anxiously. We must go to the deep swamp at once.
Not all of us, I think, said Tariq. Can G help him? Her healing?
Oh, of course, said Malin.
There was a bright flash, and the panda appeared. G looked down at Rolan, gave a sigh, and began to lick his head. The boy groaned and moved, the first time he had done so since they'd been watching.
How could you let him get so sick? Asked Malin, looking up at the others. I didn't notice, said Abeka quietly, feeling shame in the face of Malin's accusation. He didn't say anything.
I should have noticed, said Li Shay and Tariq at the same time.
G is helping him, said Abeka. Look, the red, it's fading.
Although the bright red rash was retreating a little, it didn't entirely go away.
Your spirit animal has eased his suffering, but there is only one cure, said Jodabodda. We are leaving to attend to other matters, and will return before sunset tomorrow. Bring the banana gourds here. If you succeed, we will allow you passage to the Lake of the Elephant. Fail, and your friend will die. We will take you to our borders, and whatever fate awaits you beyond our lands."
"Where is the deep swamp?" asked Connor.
Jodha Bodha smiled a grim smile.
"It is your task, not mine,"
he said, and walked away to a waiting rhino. Leaping onto its back, he patted its flank and took hold of a chain that pierced the base of its pointed horn. Jodha Bodha raised his hand and pointed to the west. A great snorting and bellowing came from the riders, and then they were all in motion at once, leaping onto their leathery steeds and charging out of the clearing, many of them swerving to avoid the small knot of green cloaks and the great rock. Tariq freed Abeka, and she helped him free the others. Maylin did not move from Roland's side, her hand on G's neck, as the panda continued to slowly lick the boy's head. "Lishay, do you know where the deep swamp is?" asked Abeka. "Roughly," answered Lishay. "We'd best get going as soon as we can. Tariq, perhaps you should stay with Roland and Maylin."
"I am not sure," said Tariq. "I doubt if the rhino riders have really left this place unguarded. Roland should be safe enough here with Maylin."
The falcon lifted her head and gave a piercing whistle.
"And with Essex and G, of course,"
added Tariq.
"You may need me and Lumio in the swamp."
"We're only going to get some banana gourds," said Abeka. "How hard can that be?" No one answered.
"We can't leave yet," said Connor.
He was staring at Maylin with pinched intensity.
"I have to say, I have to know. Maylin, why did you come back?"
She stood up and faced him. The air between them crackled with tension, and Abeka instinctively went to intervene. They couldn't fight about that again now. But they didn't fight. I made a mistake," said Maylin. "I shouldn't have left, Connor."
"Oh,"
said Connor. His ears turned bright red, but he didn't drop his eyes, and for the first time in days, he didn't apologize.
"I'm glad," he said. "Did you find your father?"
Maylin nodded, then shook her head sharply once. Clearly she didn't want to talk about that. "I got lost on the way into Zhong. A marked woman rescued me in the great bamboo maze. I think she used to be a green cloak. Her name was Shu."
"Shu,"
Tariq exclaimed. "You know her?" asked Maylin.
"I thought she was dead,"
said Tariq.
"Shu left the Green Cloaks when I was young. She said there was too much talking and not enough doing."
"And she's right," said Maylin, looking down at Roland. "Even now, we're too much talking and not enough doing." "Yes," said Lishay, nodding. "We must go." Abeka and Connor looked at each other, then back at Maylin. They had only just been reunited, and now they were parting again. It felt not wrong exactly, but dangerous. Tempting fate. "Good luck," said Maylin, turning back to Roland and G.
"You too," said Connor. "Look after him."
"We'll be back soon," Abeka promised them all. Chapter 11. Dangerous Waters.
"We'll need our spirit animals to guide us from here onward,"
said Tariq, surveying the swamp ahead. For the last hour the ground had been gradually sloping down, and the jungle floor had become wetter and wetter as the trees began to thin. Now they faced open ground with pools of stagnant water lined at the edges with tufts of reeds. Small islands of mud were dotted everywhere, surrounded by thick rafts of clotted weeds. Brightly coloured fungus peeked at them from every nook and grotto. Connor didn't recognize any of the species, but felt safe assuming they were all deadly.
"Uraza won't like this,"
said Abeka, calling her spirit animal forth.
"Neither will Briggan," said Connor, doing the same.
"Best to have them ready to help, though," said Lishay. She scratched Josur behind the ears, and the tiger purred, almost like a house cat, though it was much deeper and 3 times as loud.
"What do banana gourds grow on?" asked Connor.
"Palm-like trees," said Lishay. "There must be a bigger island somewhere. They wouldn't grow in this part of the swamp."
"I wonder if Briggan could smell a banana gourd tree," said Connor.
He bent down by the wolf and looked into his eyes.
"Do you know banana gourd trees?"
Briggan licked his face. Connor leaned back, laughing. It was the first time he had laughed for a long time. Maylin's return had released something that had been tied up very tightly inside him.
"I'm not sure if that's a yes. Will you lead the way, Briggan?"
The wolf turned on his tail and set out into the swamp, sniffing the ground and taking a meandering path to the nearest small island.
"I think we should follow him exactly," said Connor, "unless you want to fall in."
They all waded carefully after Briggan. Josur didn't seem to mind the water too much, but Uraza yowled with her first steps and tried to lift her paws high out of the water.
"It's not that bad," said Abeka. "There's solid ground up ahead. Somewhere."
"And Briggan's doing a great job of finding the way through," said Connor.
A moment later, the wolf disappeared with a loud splash, reappearing a few seconds later, violently dog-paddling in a circle back to where he'd stepped off.
"I shouldn't have distracted him," said Connor loyally, quickly brushing the mud and slime off the wolf. "Too much water," said Tariq. "He can't smell the path. This is a job for Lumio, I think."
Lumio made a chuckling noise and launched off Tariq's shoulder into the water, flowing into it as if he were liquid himself. He duck-dove several times, sped up and down the line of green cloaks, and then went ahead, sometimes swimming, sometimes leaping around on the muddy parts.
"Give him a few minutes, and he'll find us a good path ahead," said Tariq.
Lumio returned and led them on into the swamp. A few miles in, they found several larger islands that were higher and drier than the previous mounds of mud. But even when they had trees, none of them turned out to be banana gourd trees.
"It's getting dark," said Connor, looking up at the sky. "We'd better choose an island to camp on."
"I don't think that's a good idea," said Lishay.
"We're not seriously going to walk through this at night, are we?"
"Look," said Tariq, pointing at his spirit animal. Lumio was standing up on his hind feet, his head cocked to one side. A moment later, Briggan whined and started to circle around Connor. The 2 big cats pricked up their ears, and both growled simultaneously. Far off in the distance, they saw the flare of torches dipping up and down. There was a long line of them, but it was too dark already to see anything but vague shapes behind the flames.
"People with torches, wading," said Tariq. "Strange."
"They're not the rhino riders," said Connor, certain that Briggan would have recognized their scent.
"I can see something in the water," said Tariq.
Lumio jumped wetly to Tariq's shoulder. Man and otter peered into the darkness, toward the flickering lights.
"Some things moving fast."
"Could be crocodiles," said Lishay, "but the crocs here are freshwater ones. They aren't very big, and they don't attack humans."
"Unless they are affected by the bile," said Tariq bleakly. "They're moving fast, being driven by that line of torchbearers."
"Toward us," said Abeka. "That can be no accident."
"Hadn't we better get on one of these islands, then?"
asked Connor nervously. He wouldn't be happy until he was up on dry land.
"Yes, that's our best option," said Tariq.
The few bigger islands were already turning into dim silhouettes in the twilight. He pointed to the closest.
"Lumio, find us a way to that one."
Lumio wasted no time playing around now. The others followed him quickly, relieved to get out of the water and up onto the island. But it was only a few feet above the water, with some sickly palms at the center. There was no real cover, and no defense against crocodiles or the people who were herding them.
"It's very dark," said Connor.
"Try tapping into Brigand's senses," said Tariq. "You too, Abeka. Ask for your spirit animal's help. That's what I do with Lumio."
"And I with Josur," said Li Shay. "Not all bonds are the same, but—" Li Shay never finished her sentence, her hand flashing to her sword hilt. There was an abrupt thrashing in the water nearby, and suddenly 2 huge crocodiles swarmed up the muddy slope of the island. Each was over 12 feet long and swollen with hideous muscle. Their deep-set eyes were red with more than just anger.
"These are no spirit animals,"
thought Connor, as the crocodiles charged straight at the Greencloaks. The 2 big cats leaped at the closest crocodile. Josur jumped over its head with a snarl and fastened his huge jaws on the reptile's left rear leg. Uraza followed a moment later to fasten onto the croc's right. Both hung on, digging their paws into the mud as the croc whipped its tail and writhed backward, trying to snap at them with its 3-foot-long toothy jaw. As it strained to bite them, Tariq sprang forward and thrust his sword, 2-handed, up into the soft parts of its throat. Brigand confronted the second croc, jumping aside at the last instant as it snapped at him, then jumping again to lead it farther inland, allowing Connor to chop at the croc's hindquarters with his axe. Abeka, standing calmly where she was, knocked an arrow and sent it at the croc's head. She aimed for the eye, but missed it by a fraction of an inch, the arrow ricocheting off the reptile's thick hide. The croc snapped again at Brigand, ramming into a tree as the wolf ducked aside, only narrowly avoiding losing his tail to the wickedly pointed teeth. Without even thinking about what he was doing, Connor ran up the crocodile's broad back, balancing precariously on the spiny ridges. The crocodile backed away. Connor almost fell off, but managed to raise his axe over his head and bury it deep into the crocodile's head, just behind its eyes. To his amazement and horror, that didn't kill it. If anything, it only made it more enraged. The axe remained embedded as it flung its head from side to side, roaring, then rolled completely over. Connor only just jumped aside before it crushed him beneath its bulk. His axe lost, he drew his knife, though that would be of little use. The crocodile turned, impossibly tight, and advanced, the axe like some strange crest sticking out of its head. Connor kept his eyes fixed on its furious red glare, ready to dodge aside as it snapped at him. Then Abeka appeared at his side and sent an arrow at point-blank range into one eye socket, and then the next, both of them driven home with such power that they disappeared up to their fletches. The crocodile lurched forward several paces, claws clutching at the mud, then collapsed at their feet. Tariq came over and helped Connor pull his axe out of the dead croc. Its twisted muscles were still as hard as rock. "Quickly!" called Li Shay, standing on the back of the second croc and surveying the swamp around them. "Cut some staves from the tree and get going. There are more of these vile creatures coming." Connor's axe came free with a hideous sucking sound. Tariq clapped his hand on Connor's shoulder and went to join Li Shay. "Keep moving along our present course," he said to Connor and Abeka. "We'll lead the other crocodiles away and catch up when we can." "Is that safe?" Abeka asked. "Don't worry," said Li Shay. "You'll be fine if you stay under cover." The girl's teeth flashed in the dark. "I meant safe for you." Tariq grinned in return. He exchanged a look with Li Shay, who nodded. Then the 2 of them and their spirit animals raced off to the other side of the island, shouting and splashing as they entered the water. There were answering roars and shouts off in the distance, and Connor and Abeka saw the line of lights from the torchbearers began to move after the older Greencloaks.
"Is it just me, or are they having too much fun?" asked Connor.
"The trust of a good friend is precious," Abeka said. "It makes bearable even the darkest of nights." Connor shifted awkwardly on his feet. He wasn't sure if she was talking about Tariq and Li Shay, or about how he had betrayed Roland's trust. What if Maylin's return wasn't enough to heal the breach between them? If Roland died, they might never get the chance to make up. "Cut some staves for us, as quietly as you can," said Abeka. "Uraza and I will keep watch." Connor went to the nearest tree and began to cut off some branches, holding the axe close to the head so he could chip away very quietly. Even though he knew Abeka and Uraza were watching his back, he couldn't help but feel shivers along his spine. Every slight sound made him think a crocodile was about to leap upon him. He had never cut a pair of staves so quickly. Handing one to Abeka, they crossed to the far side of the island and began to feel for a path. "Which way do we go?" asked Connor. He had lost track of the landmarks during the fight. "That way," said Abeka, pointing. "According to the stars, that is the way we were going. Toward the sign of the elephant's trunk, see?" Connor looked up where she was indicating. A row of stars did suggest the outline of an elephant's trunk, though it was not a constellation he knew. "Perhaps that's good luck," he whispered, glad that there at least were stars to look at. There were clouds over the swamp, but not so many as in the jungle. He wished the stars provided a little more light, though, so he could see anything creeping up on him. Briggan nudged his hip to get Connor's attention. He looked down into the wolf's black eyes, wondering what they had picked out of the darkness. "Wait a moment," he said to Abeka. "Remember what Tariq said about using our animals' senses?" "Of course!" She bent down and hugged Uraza. Connor knelt by Briggan's side and did the same. "Shut your eyes," he said, "and ask." They shut their eyes, and both mumbled a request to their spirit animals to help them see. When they opened them again, Connor gasped. He could see much more, but it was like the world was lit by a curious bluish light. It wasn't bright enough to cast shadows, but he could see farther across the water. He also could smell much more, particularly Briggan, but he could now identify the different smells of the plants nearby, and Uraza, and Abeka, and himself. Connor wrinkled his nose and sneezed, muffling it at the last minute with his hand. Briggan looked up at him with a tongue-lolling grin and woofed as though amused by his reaction. "Did it work?" asked Abeka. "Yes," said Connor. "I can smell better too. What about you?" "I'm not sure," said Abeka slowly. Uraza's head butted hard against hers, rubbing from side to side. "It is lighter, but my eyes feel strange. It will take a bit of getting used to, this ability. I think you should lead, for now." They waded out, Connor prodding the ground in front and close to either side as he went, with Abeka and the spirit animals reluctantly following. Uraza actually hissed with almost every step, and Briggan growled several times when the water became deeper, or there were reeds and water weeds to wade through. Connor used his enhanced senses to study the water around him as closely as he followed the stars ahead, but either there was nothing in there, or he still couldn't see it. They walked and waded in this way for several hours, until Connor found himself stepping through shallower water, and slowly they climbed out onto the shores of a much larger island. With his new night sight, he could see the dim silhouettes of large trees farther up, but he wasn't sure how far away they were. However, they did offer the hope of finding banana gourds, the first suggestion they had yet had that they were going in the right direction. "I think we should rest here," he said quietly. As they moved, the ground beneath them had turned from mud to something like damp earth, the reeds giving way to a softer grass. "We can look for the banana gourds at dawn." "Yes," said Abeka. "I'll take the first watch." "Are you sure? Briggan and Uraza can watch for us. You must be as tired as I am, and I can barely stay awake." "I'm not so tired," said Abeka stiffly. although Connor was sure she really was.
"All right, you take the first watch," he said.
There was no shame in admitting to exhaustion. Besides, they would be no help to Roland or anyone else if they were both so worn out they made mistakes. Sighing, he lay down in the grass, setting his axe close by his hand. A couple of leeches he hadn't noticed fell off his wrist, bloated with blood.
Can you tell when an hour's up?"
"The stars will tell me," said Abeka.
"Wake me in an hour, then,"
said Connor. He scratched Brigand's head. The wolf gave a throaty rumble and lay down next to him, a warm and comforting body. A moment later, Connor was fast asleep. Chapter 12. Alone. It was very quiet after everyone left the clearing. She stopped licking Roland's head, but she lay down next to him and put a paw on his chest, where Essex had been sitting. Essex hopped onto the panda's shoulder, wanting to be higher but not willing to be separated from Roland. Maylin's options now were limited. Since the others had left, she'd done little more than pace restlessly around the rhino-shaped rock to make sure there weren't any enemies hiding nearby, or rhino riders. She wasn't sure if they could be called enemies or not. They certainly weren't allies. She had a suspicion that Jodoboda had been playing a trick on the others, sending them off in search of something that would ultimately prove to be useless, while she stayed behind, feeling useless herself. "My hope lies with you," her father had said. How was she helping him now, sitting here, doing nothing? Sometimes she wished someone would attack, just so she would have something to do. She came back to Roland and looked down at him. G's healing powers had lessened the red rash on his face, but he still looked very sick. She didn't want to imagine what would happen if Jodoboda's so-called cure didn't work. "I hope those banana gourd seeds help you, Roland," she said, unable to keep the tension from her voice, then jumped as the boy suddenly opened one eye, just a crack.
"Blow do I?"
he whispered. It took her a moment to work out he'd said, "So do I." Maylin knelt by his side. "Do you need some water?" Roland shook his head slightly. He still only had one eye half open.
"Who came back?"
he said, which she correctly interpreted as, "You came back." "Don't talk," she said. "Save your strength."
"Cold," said Roland.
The word was quite clear. Maylin frowned. It was as hot as ever in the jungle clearing, but she saw Roland's pack nearby, so she got a blanket from it and wrapped him up in it. "Is that better?" she asked anxiously. But Roland did not reply. G stirred and leaned across, then started to lick the boy's head again. Essex looked at her, and Maylin wondered what else she could or should do to help him. Roland's life had been entrusted to her, but something more than pride drove her to want to help him. He was unruly and impulsive, and his sense of duty was very different from hers. He still hadn't agreed to become a Greencloak. But she had no doubt that in her shoes he would think of something to make her feel better, even if it was just to make her laugh, or try to. Sometimes he could be so annoying. A faint noise came from one of the nearby clumps of elephant grass. Immediately she stood up, her staff ready. The tops of the grass were waving, perhaps caused by something as innocent as a breath of wind, or by stealthy movement of something coming toward them. Essex launched from G's shoulder with a screech, shot up to a height of about 100 feet, and hovered there, watching whoever or whatever it was that was approaching. Essex didn't screech a warning or dive to attack, but even so, Maylin's grip on her staff tightened, and she adopted a defensive stance, ready for whatever might spring out of the elephant grass. It wasn't a tiger, and it didn't leap. It was Shu, with her towering pack, The old woman hunched over beneath it. She emerged from the taller grass and walked toward Meilin.
Shoo! I didn't expect to see you again.
Why not?
Asked Shoo. I just didn't, said Meilin. What are you doing here?
Selling pots to the Turgesh, said Shoo.
She set her pack down and slowly straightened out, her hands on her hips.
They gather here this time of year? Or they usually do,
she added, looking around at the empty grass.
They're coming back, said Meilin. Tomorrow. My friends have gone to complete a task set by their leader, Jodaboda.
The Turgesh and their tasks, said Shoo.
She bent down and looked at Rolan. A second later, Essex landed near her and hopped onto Rolan's chest.
Oh, this one's yours, is he, Essex?
Asked Shoo.
Sunset death. Not good. You have any banana gourd seeds?
No, said Meilin. Are they really a cure? The others have gone to get some.
Part of the cure, said Shoo. He is unlucky to have caught it. Insect bite gone wrong. We need to move him near the rock.
Why? Asked Meilin.
Rain, said Shoo, pointing at the sky.
She pointed at the rock.
We'll take shelter there.
The rain's warm, said Meilin doubtfully. Should he be moved?
Won't feel warm to him, said Shoo.
She opened the top of her pack and rummaged around inside, pulling out a tightly folded square of oiled silk, some light cord, and several tent pegs. Going over to the rock, she quickly erected a shelter, tying the waterproof fabric off to the horn and pegging the other end down.
You take his legs, she said to Meilin, going to Rolan's head and lifting him under the shoulders. Essex, you fly. Too heavy.
Surprisingly, Essex did exactly as Shoo said, flying off to perch on the rhino horn on the rock, while Meilin and Shoo carried Rolan to the shelter. G ambled after them and pushed her way under the makeshift tent next to Rolan, leaving no room for anyone else.
Ha! cackled Shoo. The panda is lazy and a water shirker.
They had barely gotten Rolan settled when the shower suddenly began, not with any preliminary drops, but a full-on deluge, as if high above someone had just overturned a giant bucket. Meilin crouched with her back against the rock, which didn't really do anything to stop the rain, but felt like it might help somehow. Shoo dragged her pack over, rummaged in it again, and produced a beautiful waxed paper umbrella, illustrated with pictures of a dancing mouse. It was evidently modelled on her spirit animal, who was either in the dormant state or lurking in his special pocket.
Tariq, the senior greencloak with us, said Meilin hesitantly. He said that he'd heard of you. You retired from the Greencloaks years and years ago. Is that true?
Greencloaks rarely retire, said Shoo. I took a long leave of absence. Probably time to come back. The younger ones are not so well trained.
Well, we've only just started, protested Meilin, and we haven't done too badly. We've gotten the granite ram, and even though we lost the iron boar, there was an understandable reason for that.
Shoo laughed a short, high-pitched laugh.
Not you, Olvan, Lenori, always forgetting my lessons.
Oh, said Meilin, wondering at the thought that Olvan and Lenori were once students like her. And bad students at that. It was impossible to imagine.
We should make fire for tea, said Shoo,
not letting herself be drawn on the subject.
Collect dry rhino dung before it gets too wet. There are piles of it near the jungle edge, under trees.
I'll go,
said Meilin, jumping to her feet, water cascading off her shoulders where it had gathered.
Yes, said Shoo.
5 minutes later, as she gathered the driest rhino dung she could find, Meilin wondered why she had volunteered so readily. She would never have dreamed back home that she would ever do something like collect dung, even if the dry pieces really just felt like pieces of light wood. But she wanted Shu to respect her, and the only way to do that was to do what needed to be done, even if it was something like collecting dung for a fire. At least she didn't feel quite so trapped now. She had someone to talk to, whose words she didn't have to think twice about before understanding them. She smiled. That was the kind of thing Roland might have said. The rain eased off as she walked back, and then it stopped abruptly. The clouds edged apart, and Mei Ling caught a glimpse of the setting sun through the western tree line. Under Shu's direction, she stacked the dry dung in a pyramid in the lee of the rock, some distance from the shelter. Shu lit it with a twisted piece of oily paper and a clockwork fire starter, a beautifully enamelled egg in 2 halves that had to be turned 15 times. It would not have been out of place in her father's treasure cabinet, Mei Ling thought. Shu rigged up her tripod and cooking pot and made tea. After they drank their own, Mei Ling took some of the cooled tea and spooned it into Roland's mouth. After several tries, she got him to swallow some, but he wasn't really conscious, and he did not speak again.
"You're good to care for him," the old woman said with an approving nod.
"Who else is going to do it?" Mei Ling said with a frustrated sigh.
"Caring takes many forms."
"You mean there's something else I should be doing?"
"No." Shu squinted with one eye, but the other was wide open. "You know, loneliness is a kind of death, too."
Mei Ling looked away, not really understanding, but feeling as though Shu was seeing her with a clarity that made her uncomfortable. "Jodoboda said he will die by tomorrow's sunset, unless he has the cure," Mei Ling said, to bring the conversation back on track.
"This is true," said Shu.
She took a jar of rice out of her pack, some dried meat that was probably rat, and several herb containers, and began to prepare dinner.
"But not until then. After dinner, we sleep. The animals will keep watch. Zap too."
She opened the top of her jacket. The jumping mouse lived up to his name by jumping out. He ran over to Mei Ling, who held out her hand. He climbed into it, and she lifted him up near her face to see him better in the twilight. He was entirely white, but did not have an albino's red eyes. His eyes were deep and very knowing. "I used to think only the big, fierce spirit animals were any good," Mei Ling confessed, carefully setting Zap back down. He jumped over to Ji and sat near her front paw, like some small retainer sitting before the Empress.
"Big, small, doesn't matter," said Shu. "It's a spirit animal, not a simple animal. True strength is unrelated to size or fierceness."
"I guess I'm getting to know that," said Mei Ling with a glance at Ji.
"True bonds test us," Shu said with a nod, collecting up their empty bowls. "Sleep now."
Mei Ling looked at Roland, thinking of his sharp wit, and how, even though he hadn't taken any vows, he had stayed, when she had not. She realized for the first time that she thought of him not just as an equal, but as a friend. She hadn't ever really had any friends before, just servants and the children of officers lower ranking than her father. "Is there really nothing else I can do?"
Shu shook her head. "Tell me your dreams later, if you have any strange ones."
"Will they tell the future?"
"No. I like a good story."
Mei Ling forced herself to lean back against the rock. It was too wet to lie down, but some of the warmth from the fire reached her. She was restless and tired at the same time. She watched Roland lying with the spirit animals, his breath shallow. It was awful being so helpless, knowing that unless Abeka and Connor and the others got back in time with the banana gourd seeds, He would die. But he wasn't alone, and neither now was she. "I shouldn't have gone away," she whispered, as much to Rolan as to herself, although she knew he couldn't hear her. "I won't make that mistake again." Chapter 13. Tall Trees and Thorn Bushes. Abeka woke up with a start. The first faint light of dawn was falling on their sleeping spot in the grass. Connor was slumped on his side nearby, curled up next to Briggan. The wolf looked at her with ears standing straight upright. Uraza was sitting on her haunches next to him, licking mud from her fur. Abeka's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't woken Connor to take his watch. In fact, she had nodded off and fallen asleep through her watch as well. They had been completely exposed, and it was her fault. She staggered up and looked around. They were on a large island, all right, and the big trees were really tall palm trees, the smallest easily 100 feet high. They were all lined up along a central ridge, several hundred yards away, and perhaps 100 feet higher, well out of the swampy ground. Best of all, she could see they had bunches of some kind of curvy fruit hanging from the upper branches. They had to be banana gourds. She went off a little way to think very hard about what to do. She could lie and tell Connor that she had let him sleep, or she could confess and tell him the truth about what had happened. She called herself a hunter of the Niloan savannah, yet she had fallen asleep on her watch. When she returned, Connor was muttering in his sleep, as if he was having a nightmare. "The sheep. We'll never get them all in. What are you doing? No, not that way. No, not that way." She crouched down next to him and touched his shoulder. He sat bolt upright with eyes wide open, panting. "You were having a bad dream," she said. "I was," he said, looking around him. "The flock. There was a—" His eyes fell on Briggan, and he reached out to hug the wolf. "Wait. The sun's up. What happened to our agreement? Why did you let me sleep?" How easy it would be to lie, she thought. He trusts me. "I dropped off without realizing," she said, prepared for his anger. "That was why I didn't wake you up. I was asleep too. I'm sorry." He nodded gravely. "So, Uraza kept watch, with Briggan?" "Yes." "I don't see the problem." He smiled at her. "They would have woken us if anything had come near. Don't worry, I won't tell anyone. Okay?" She hesitated, and then said, "Okay." He stood up and looked at the sun, the swamp, and the trees, in that order. "I don't suppose there's time for breakfast," he said, not sounding terribly hopeful. "We've only got till nightfall to find the banana gourds and get them back to Jodaboda," Abeka said, standing up and stowing her bow and arrows. "We can eat while we walk." "I guess so." He rubbed at the sleep still crusting his eyes, and Briggan yawned in sympathy, white teeth and red gums gleaming in the morning light. "These banana gourds had better work." Abeka didn't speak. She hoped Jodaboda was telling the truth about a cure for Rolan. She also hoped that Tariq and Lishay were all right, and that they had managed to lead the crocodiles far away. Because getting the banana gourds was one thing, returning with them to the rhino riders across the swamp might be another altogether. The ridge was higher than it looked, and it was more difficult to get to the palm trees than the two greencloaks had anticipated. Halfway up the slope, there were thorn bushes blocking their way, and even Briggan and Uraza could not find a way through them, so they had to walk along and look for a gap. When they eventually did find one, it led into another wall of thorny hedges. "This is a maze," said Connor, "like that bamboo one Mei Lin said she went through." "That's much bigger," replied Abeka. "Huge. This is small. I believe these are called snare vines." "It's going to slow us down for sure,"
said Connor gloomily, "and we can't waste any time."
"There might be a way," Abeka said. She pointed to the nearest tree. It was about 20 yards away, across the tangle of thorn bushes, and perhaps 20 feet up the slope. "What if one of us used the granite ram to jump to the lowest branch on that tree?"
Connor looked up and frowned. Across thorns? If it didn't work, and even if it did, those branches don't look strong.
"We have to try," said Abeka. "There isn't time to walk along the snare vine bushes, hoping to find a way in."
"You're right," he said slowly. "Let me do it."
Abeka shook her head. She took off her pack and laid her bow on top of it. "I'm the best jumper, and I was the last one to practice with the granite ram," she said. "Uraza will help me too."
"I can do it," Connor insisted. "I won't let you down."
Abeka shook her head again. "It's not that. Yes, I was angry with you over the iron boar, but we've all made mistakes. I made one last night."
"Mine was a particularly big one," he started to say.
"If a crocodile had crept up on us last night, mine would have been pretty big too. We could be dead now, not arguing about who's most at fault." He looked down at his feet, then back up at her.
"All right then," he said. "You are the best jumper, and we have no time for second chances."
Abeka looked up at the tree and the thorn bushes in between. She would have to do a standing jump over the high thorns, up 20 feet and across about 60. Grab that branch there, which would probably break, but it would slow her down, and she could drop from there to the ground. But she couldn't see the ground. There could be anything there. More thorns, sharp stones, anything. Uraza grumbled at her side. Abeka rested her hand on the leopard's head. "I'll need your help," she said. "You and the ram." Uraza's tail twitched, but the grumbling stopped. Abeka felt strength flow into her. Strength and the feline grace of the big cat, energizing her muscles. She touched the granite ram that hung on its chain around her neck and drew on its power too. Then she jumped, and the earth seemed to fall away beneath her. Connor's whistle followed her as she flew through the air, high over the thorns. The whistle faltered when she reached the highest point of her incredible leap, and it looked like she was going to miss the tree. Connor was forgotten as she flailed wildly for a branch on the way down, missed grabbing it properly, but slowed herself enough to spin end over end and land belly first on the next branch down. Winded, it was all she could do to hang on, relieved that she had at least come to a halt. She rocked backward and forward for a few seconds, raising one hand to wave at Connor to let him know that she was okay. Then, with a horrible tearing noise, the branch came away from the tree. For the briefest moment, Abeka was suspended. Then she fell, hands desperately clawing the air for a hold that was no longer there. "Abeka!" shouted Connor. Uraza yowled. Fortunately, the base of the tree was home to only young vines, so the thorns she landed on merely pricked her rather than causing her serious harm. She lay among them, catching her breath, then called out to reassure Connor and Uraza so they wouldn't try to follow her. "I'm all right. I'll go back up in a minute." The tree looked much taller than it had from down below. It also looked much higher than the mainmast of the Tellen's Pride, though at least it wasn't swaying from side to side. The bark of the trunk was rough, with sufficient handholds to get her to the first branch. Once she was breathing properly, she reached up and took a firm grip. Staying close to the trunk, she climbed carefully until the first branch was within reach, then just as carefully tested its weight. It held, so she transferred herself and pulled herself up. From there she climbed carefully from branch to branch, quickly learning that the branches would come away if she planted her feet wrong and put too much weight on them.
I see you, called Connor when she ascended into view. You're doing great.
Rebecca didn't turn to look. Just thinking of him so far below her made her falter. She touched the granite ram again. Save me if I fall, she whispered, and then felt a little ashamed to be so fearful. If she didn't think about the thorns below, or her steadily increasing altitude, and if she concentrated hard on where she put her hands and feet, she would be fine. So she told herself. And so it was. After an ascent that seemed to last hours, she looked up and she saw a cluster of the banana-shaped gourds hanging halfway along a branch, slightly farther around the tree. There were 6 of the gourds there, 2 more than she needed, but she couldn't reach them yet. Rebecca started to edge around as she climbed, going faster with the gourds now in sight. They were too far along the branch to reach, but she thought if she could break the branch off, they would fall to the ground. As she knew from her own fall, the vines were thick down there. The gourds should survive the descent. But the branch wouldn't break off. Rebecca tugged at it and twisted it, but it simply wouldn't come away from the trunk. The gourds didn't fall off either, as she had hoped they might. Rebecca stopped working on the branch. There was another bunch of gourds higher up, and a little closer to the trunk. Maybe she could reach out and pull them off, one by one. She gave the branch another resentful tug, but when that didn't work, started to climb again. She was now at least 50 feet above the ground, and the higher branches were crackling under her feet, as if they were even more precarious than the ones lower down. Rebecca started to climb faster, a little less carefully. She wanted to spend less time on each branch, giving it fewer chances to fail. One cracked completely as she climbed, and she would have fallen if she had not leaped for the next. Shocked by the sudden noise and the lurch underneath her, Rebecca accelerated again. Reaching the branch with the gourds, she leaned out and plucked them off incredibly quickly, letting them fall to the ground. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then another one for luck, and she was on her way, climbing back down, trying to keep hold with at least one hand every time she moved her feet. She got to within 25 feet of the ground and was feeling incredibly relieved when disaster struck. 2 branches broke at once, one under her hand and one under her foot. The crack of them breaking mixed with her shout as she fell backward from the tree. Rebecca plummeted. The chain holding the granite ram slipped over her head. It caught on her nose and for a frenzied second held there as she crossed her eyes, staring at it and willing it to stay. But it didn't, falling away with all the finality of a shooting star that will never be seen again. Uraza yowled below, and with it, Rebecca felt a burst of unexpected power. Somehow she pivoted while falling, exactly like a cat, and hooked one leg over a lower branch. So gracefully she surprised even herself. She swung around the branch, grabbed another, and then swung to a third, making an astonishingly swift and acrobatic descent to the ground. There, she searched anxiously among the vines for the granite ram, her heart pounding. If she'd lost it, that would be the second talisman gone. Connor at least had a reason to give away the iron boar. Just losing a talisman out of carelessness would be much worse. Then she saw the glint of the chain, draped across one of the fallen gourds. She put her hand to her throat and breathed again. Gathering up the granite ram, she slipped it over her head and knotted the chain to shorten it. There was no way that talisman would come off again. It took her several minutes longer to find the gourds. In the end, she could only find 4 of the 5. The 5th one must have rolled away, lost in the snare vine thorns. "I've got 4!" she shouted, tying them up in her shirt and buttoning her sailor's jacket over the top. "I'm going to climb up and jump to you." Connor's anxious shout came back. "Be careful!" Rebecca retraced her slow ascent up the tree, more painfully than the first time, her muscles aching from the previous exertion, and with numerous small bruises from her fall. She concentrated on moving very patiently. She would need all her strength, plus the powers of the talisman and her spirit animal, to make the leap back over the thorns safely. Uraza clearly felt the risk too. When Abeka rose up above the vines and could see her again, the leopard was pacing backward and forward, continually looking up toward the tree and Abeka. "Don't move," called out Abeka when she was about 30 feet up. "I don't want to land on you." Uraza stopped and settled on her haunches. Connor stood perfectly still, Briggan at his side. Abeka looked down at them, held her breath, and jumped. Chapter 14. Hope. Maylin watched the sun and the shadow it cast from the horn of the Rhino Rock. Rolan hadn't said anything since complaining about the cold. Occasionally he shivered, as he was shivering now. His teeth chattered. "It's the 2nd hour of the afternoon," she said. As the day grew old, her patience with waiting grew short. "Maybe I should go and try to find them." "They will come," said Shu. Maylin turned to look at the old woman. "Do you know that for sure?" she asked. "You're certain they'll be back with the banana gourds in time?" "Yes." "How? Have you had a vision or something?" Shu shook her head. "I don't have visions, just hope." "Hope?" said Maylin. "Hoping won't do anything." "So go," said Shu. "I'm not stopping you." What? This Maylin couldn't believe. Shu would let her abandon Rolan and head off into the jungle on what might possibly be a fruitless quest? Then she caught herself and realized that even she wasn't convinced that it was the right thing to do. But what else could she do? G had been watching over Rolan the whole time, alternating between licking his head and placing a paw on his chest. At first, the violently red rash on his face had faded, but now it was even brighter and had spread down his neck and behind his ears. His breathing was becoming increasingly ragged. Her heart ached in sympathy, as though she were coming down with something too. She knew she couldn't stay and watch him die. "You'll really let me go?" she asked Shu, wondering if this was some kind of trick. "Of course. Too comfortable to get up." That had to be a lie. Even with the grass to sit on, the ground was hard. "Then I will go. Will you stay and look after Rolan?" "Not going anywhere," said Shu. "Got to sell some pots to the Turgesh." "Gee, you should stay too," said Maylin. "The panda is too lazy to leave," laughed Shu. "Except as a tattoo." Shu's nonchalance made Maylin feel slightly foolish, but she was determined to go, now that she had come to a decision. If Shu was trying to talk her out of going by not talking her out of going, that simply wouldn't work. "I'll go as far as the swamp," said Maylin. "I might be able to see them from there." She picked up her staff and looked down at Rolan. The shivering had ceased for the moment. It left him looking completely lifeless, or nearly so. "Are you sure there's nothing else we can do for him?" she asked. Shu shook her head, all levity lost. "I'll be back before nightfall," said Maylin, "with the others and the banana gourds." Shu smiled again. "See? Hope is good. Powerful." Maylin didn't feel very powerful, but that was all she had. At the edge of the clearing, she looked back, feeling a mental tug. It was strange going off into the jungle without G. They hadn't been separated since the ceremony that had joined them together. The panda lifted her head to look at her, and their eyes met. "Look after him," whispered Maylin. Shu turned her head as if she'd heard the whisper, which was impossible. Maylin blushed and looked away, the sensation uncomfortable. She never blushed, and there was no reason to blush now. Was there? G bent down to Rolan again, and Maelin strode off into the jungle.
Chapter 15. Sunset. Abeka almost made it. She fell slightly short and landed on the very edge of the thorn trees, crashing through them to tumble onto the path near Connor, one sleeve already bloody from where the thorns had ripped through her coat and shirt, and the skin beneath. Connor rushed to her side, but Uraza was even faster. The leopard whined and nosed Abeka, who slowly sat up and looked at her arm. "Is it bad?" asked Connor. He was already tearing off his shirt tail to use as a bandage, but he stopped as Abeka held up her hand. "Just scratches," said Abeka, pulling the torn cloth apart to investigate. "Nothing very deep, and I got the gourds." She undid the knotted ends of her shirt and showed Connor the 4 banana gourds. They didn't look like much, just curved, dry gourds, the length of her index finger. Connor picked one up and shook it, the seeds rattling about inside. "We'd better clean those scratches," said Connor. Abeka shook her head. "Dry, clean thorns are better than swampy water," she said, getting to her feet with a visible wince. "We must head straight back to have any chance of getting there before nightfall." "True," said Connor. Should I carry your pack too?" "I can manage it," said Abeka. She walked stiffly over to the pack, put the gourds in one of the pockets, and swung it on her back. Bending again slowly, she picked up her bow and staff and began to hobble down to the swamp, Uraza following at her heels. Connor looked at Briggan, who cocked his head sideways and let his tongue loll out. I know. She's way tougher than me," said Connor with resignation. Striking back across the swamp in the daytime rather than at night following the stars, they had to depend on the sun for direction, and on Briggan. But clouds, with occasional downpours of rain, kept obscuring the sun, and the swampy water was too deep for Briggan to easily find a trail. So Connor poked ahead with his staff, checking with Briggan every now and then that they were at least headed in the right general direction. It was slow going and very tiring, wading through water and reeds or clomping over muddy banks. Both Connor and Abeka simply couldn't go any faster, no matter how much they urged each other on. Their will was strong, but their bodies were just too tired. Connor couldn't see the sun, but he knew it was going down. He tried to increase the pace, lifting his feet higher out of the sucking mud. Rolan didn't have forever. If they took too long or got lost, he would die. Then they saw the crocodiles. 6 of them, huge beasts much larger than any normal freshwater crocodiles that should populate the area. They were lying on the muddy shores of one of the low islands that dotted the swamp. "Crocs!" warned Connor, hunkering down among the reeds, the water coming up to his armpits. Abeka did the same. Briggan and Uraza tensed beside their companions, quiet so as not to draw attention to them, but ready to spring into action if needed. "We have to try to sneak around," whispered Abeka. Connor stood up and swapped his probing staff for the axe on his back. If he had to fight his way past Crocs to get the gourds back to Rolan, then so be it. He wished Tariq and Lachey were with them, but there had been no sign of the green cloaks since they had parted the previous day. "There are too many to sneak past," he said, "but if I rush them, I'll distract them while you run." Abeka was still staring, her sharp hunter's eyes intent on the Crocs. "I think they're dead," said Abeka. "Look, one is on its back. Crocs never sleep on their backs like that." "Maybe these monstrous ones do," said Connor, but he felt a momentary hope. They edged forward, Connor holding his axe ready to strike. As he neared the bodies, he saw that Abeka was correct. The Crocs were lying absolutely still, at odd angles, their muscles straining even in death, twisting their legs and tails into tortured shapes. "Maybe Tariq and Lachey killed them," whispered Connor. Abeka shook her head. "No wounds, no blood." "Oh, right," said Connor. They drew nearer and nearer. At the waterline, Briggan and Uraza ran ahead, both of them sniffing at the bodies. Briggan recoiled and shook his head. "Look at their eyes," said Connor. The crocs were already starting to smell. Their eyes had bulged out of their sockets, and there was a black froth coming out of their noses. "I think they were given bile," Abeka said. She hesitated, then added, "I saw this being done once, when I was with Shane and Zarif. Men fed what must have been bile to animals and squabbled over how much to use. I think it reacts differently when animals drink it. They don't then bond with a human. They become enslaved monsters." "You saw it?" exclaimed Connor. "I didn't see what happened when too much was given," said Abeka. "They transformed a dog, a nice dog called Admiral. They made it into a vicious monster, much bigger than it was originally. They must still be experimenting. The bile is a poison that has to be stopped." "It will be," said Connor. "I hope. Come on, Roland's waiting. We have to go faster." "Solid ground at last," said Connor wearily, some hours later as they staggered out of the swampy water and onto the muddy shore of the jungle fringe. "I'm even glad to be heading back into the jungle." Abeka turned anxious eyes to the sun. "We're too late," she said bitterly. "We'll never make it to the clearing in time." Connor looked up at the sky. The clouds had come back, but the faint disk of the sun could just be seen, a splash of orange behind the grey. It was already beginning to set. They had failed. Despite their heroic efforts, they could never get back to the Rhino Rock in time. The two Greencloaks were exhausted, and even though it was easier than the swamp, the jungle was difficult to make their way through. Walking was hard enough, let alone running. All he could think about was Roland waiting for them, feverish and ill, perhaps dying at that very moment. Connor stopped, ankle deep in the mud. "Don't just stand there," croaked Abeka, struggling on. "We can't give up now." "I'm not giving up," said Connor angrily. He was very tired and wet and irritable, and he knew everywhere below his thighs was covered in leeches, even though he couldn't feel them. "I'm thinking. We should send the Gourds ahead with Briggan and Uraza." The two spirit animals turned to look at him. "They can hold 2 each in their mouths," said Connor. "They can go much faster than us." Abeka stared at him. She was almost too exhausted to understand what he'd said. "What if the Rhino Riders don't consider the task completed unless we do it?" she asked. "We have to risk it," said Connor. "Surely they'll still make the cure for Roland." "I don't like the idea of Uraza being away from me," said Abeka. "I don't like Briggan being away either," said Connor. "But it's our only chance of getting the Gourds there on time. It's Roland's only chance." Uraza put one strong paw on Abeka's knee, as though to support Connor's opinion. Her proud head tilted to one side. "Yes, of course, you're right," said Abeka. She swung her pack off her back to get the banana gourds out. Uraza and Briggan came up to her. Each took 2 of the gourds gently in their jaws. Connor hugged Briggan tightly. "I know you can do it," he said. The wolf's bark was muffled but firm, as though to say, "Of course we can." The 2 spirit animals sprang away, moving far more swiftly than the 2 children could have managed. "Come on," said Connor, when Briggan and Uraza were out of sight. "We've still got a long way to go." He pulled his feet out of the mud with a sucking, popping sound. Another sound came from behind, a chilling slither. For the briefest moment, Connor thought it was Abeka moving. Then he knew it was not. He spun around. Abeka crashed into him, leaping away from a huge, red-eyed crocodile that had slid up the muddy shore like an arrow shot out from under the water. It lunged at Connor, its massive jaws snapping at his leg. Just before they closed, Connor thrust his staff in the way. The staff snapped in half, but held long enough for him to get his leg clear of the sharp teeth and stagger backward, leaving him holding only a broken tree branch to face an 18-foot-long, bile-enraged crocodile. Abeka didn't have time to get her bow. She snatched an arrow from her quiver and held it like a dagger, stabbing at the crocodile's eyes from the side. Before she could find her mark, it whipped its head across and sent her flying. She landed in the mud 10 feet away. Connor tossed the broken staff into the croc's gaping mouth and reached back for his axe, but he was stuck in the mud, and his pack had ridden up. He couldn't quite reach the haft of the axe strapped to the outside, and the croc was advancing once more, its jaws opening again. Ha! Maylin's shout echoed out across the swamp as she brought her metal-bound staff down on the croc's head. It swung to snap at her, giving Connor a precious few seconds to stagger away and fumble his axe free. Thwack! 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 Maylin danced backward across the mud and onto dry land, the crocodile following her, roaring and thrashing its tail. Abeka strung her bow to hasten after the crocodile, followed by the mud-smeared Connor, his axe now held steadily in both hands. Maylin leaped onto the stump of a giant fallen tree, and the crocodile reared against it, gouging at the rotten timber with its claws and snapping at Maylin's feet. As the crocodile reared at Maylin, Abeka sent an arrow down its gullet. Connor swept the axe fast and low across the beast's throat, silencing it. The crocodile rolled away and thrashed a trail of bloody destruction halfway across the mud bank toward the open water, before it finally died. Blood streamed from its many wounds, dark rivulets spreading across the brown mud. Abeka sat down where she stood and let out a sigh that was half exhaustion and half relief. Connor stood next to her, leaning on his axe. Maylin jumped down, not looking tired at all. "Where did you come from?" Connor asked her. "I came looking for you," she said. "When I saw Briggan and Uraza, I knew you must be close. Then I heard the croc. It was huge. Have you seen many like this?" Abeka nodded somberly. "You know, General Gar's crocodile, the one I saw? It was about twice as long." Connor shuddered. Even Maylin looked uneasy. "Thanks, Maylin," he said. "We'd better get moving. Briggan and Uraza have the banana gourds, but they'll be no use to Rolan if he's alone." "He's not," said Maylin. They exchanged stories as they set off. The sun was no longer visible behind the jungle trees, though the sky was still streaked with sunset colours. All Connor's thoughts were with Briggan and Uraza. He hoped they would make it in time. Chapter 16. Return of the Rhino Riders. It was fully dark by the time Maylin, Abeka, and Connor finally reached the clearing. It was a different place from the one Maylin had left. Bright paper lanterns suspended from long bamboo poles lit up the area. Tents had been pitched in rings around the rhino rock, each with a rhino standing beside it, tethered to a thick iron peg, hammered deep into the ground. The riders themselves were gathered around several large fires, eating, drinking, and talking. Jodoboda was standing on the rhino rock, a golden goblet in his hand. Shu's shelter was gone, and Maylin could not see Rolan. There were too many rhinos and tents in the way, She started to walk faster, though for the last hour she had kept her pace to match the worn-out Connor and Abeka. He can't be dead, she thought, her heart racing. Uraza and Briggan must have gotten here before sunset. Rolan has to be alive. She started to run between the tents and rhinos, fearing what she might see, already imagining Rolan's lifeless body on the grass. Essex, crazed and hooded, bound with jesses on her feet, like any tame falcon gone feral. Jodha raised his goblet and gestured at the ground near the rock. Maylin slowed and schooled her face into its customary calm as she saw Shu sitting on her pack, a porcelain cup in her hand. And there was G next to her, a welcome sight. And next to the panda there was Rolan, sitting up and grinning like an idiot, his face already a healthier pink. Essex was on his shoulder, preening her feathers. Briggan and Uraza sat next to Rolan, but they both leaped up as their companions came hurrying behind Maylin and bounded over to greet them. She walked forward, not saying anything until she could trust her voice not to catch. Her throat felt full and tight with unexpected emotion. "So they made the cure for you," she said. "I'm glad."
"Not half as much as I am."
Rolan grinned up at her, and Maylin couldn't help but blush. Confused by her emotion, she lowered her chin, watching him from under her eyelashes. She'd thought she'd never see that smile again.
"Shu told me I would be dead if you hadn't gotten the seeds to Jodha in time," he said. "Thank you."
"It wasn't me," said Maylin. "It was Connor and Abeka." Connor and Abeka came up to stand on either side of her.
"We never would have gotten the gourds," said Connor, "if Abeka hadn't done those jumps."
Abeka shrugged. "I jumped, but Connor led. It doesn't matter who did what."
"Wise girl,"
said Shu, introducing herself to the curious Connor and Abeka. Zap poked his head out of her jacket and wiggled his whiskers at them in welcome. "All I want to do is sit down, eat, and then wash myself off," continued Abeka. "In that order."
"A full belly makes you strong," said Shu. "We should all eat."
Maylin ignored her. She needed to say something important to the others. "Jodha would never have captured you if I hadn't left," Maylin said. It was the closest thing to an apology anyone had ever heard from her. "Maybe you wouldn't have gotten sick, either."
"I would have," said Rolan, his expression pretending seriousness. "Those insects just couldn't resist me."
"But we would have seen how sick you were if we had been paying attention to each other," said Abeka. "We were so busy being angry at Connor that we weren't noticing the really important stuff."
"We work well together when we do," said Connor with a bright smile. "Remember the puppet plan? We all came up with that, although we didn't realize at the time. If you had been there, Maylin, it would have been even better."
Maylin nodded. Abeka had told her how the three of them had snuck into Shin Kao Dai. It had been a good plan. Even Rolan seemed to agree. "I think we've learned our lesson," she said.
"Already better students than Olvan and Lenori," said Shu with a quick wink.
The four children smiled at each other for a moment. Then Abeka looked up at the leader of the rhino riders, tall and proud on his rock. "Thank you for honoring our agreement and making the cure, Jodha."
"I would have made it anyway," said Jodha, raising his golden mug to her. "We keep many banana gourd seeds. The sunset death is not uncommon among my people." "What?" exclaimed Connor. "We almost got killed getting those gourds." "It was your task," said Jodha. "I consider it completed, and your true reward will be as you asked. When your other companions return, we will show you how to find the Lake of the Elephant and Dinesh."
"They're not back yet?" asked Abeka. "Where are they?"
"You do not know?" said Jodha.
Rolan looked up in alarm.
Where did they go?
Abeka quickly told them about the monstrous crocodiles and the line of torchbearers who had driven them toward the Greencloaks. Jodabodda leaned down to listen, a frown on his leathery face.
This is ill news,
he said when Abeka finished.
A force of conquerors in the swamp, feeding poison to the crocodiles. I had not thought they could be here in strength. Farsit Nang has always been left in peace. We have been left in peace.
A stone alone is just a stone, said Shu. Many together can make a wall.
Jodabodda smiled, but it was not a happy smile.
So you have said before, old mother, but the rhino riders have always stood alone.
Hidebound, said Shu with a sniff.
We have to find Tariq and Lishay, said Rolan, struggling to stand.
Shu put a hand on his shoulder and kept him down.
We'll go,
said Connor, though it clearly took all his strength to get the words out.
I'll go,
said Maylin, thinking of Tariq and Lishay wounded in the swamp or besieged by crocodiles.
No,
said Jodabodda.
You have all done enough for now, even for Greencloaks. I will send riders to search for them and to gauge the true extent of the conquerors in our territory.
He jumped off the stone and stalked out, calling out names. Riders around the big fires put down their food, and within a few minutes, a force of 30 rhinos was rumbling off along the jungle path toward the swamp.
Tired young Greencloaks should eat, said Shu, indicating her pot stewing over the fire. I have a fine rat broth with bamboo shoots.
Rat? Asked Connor. It tastes good, said Maylin. Really? I have eaten rat, said Abeka. Not as tasty as antelope. Can I have some, please? Shu smiled and bustled around, putting out bowls and spoons for everyone except Rolan, then ladling out portions of the delicious-smelling soup. Connor shared his with Briggan, but Uraza turned up her nose when Abeka offered some to the leopard.
What about some for me?
Asked Rolan plaintively. Shu shook her head.
No solid food till morning, she said. Rest now.
Just like home, said Rolan. Never enough to eat.
But he lay back down on the grass, still wrapped in his blanket. Essex hopped off as he tilted over and stalked across to stand near his head, a constant guardian. Rolan reached up to ruffle the falcon's feathers, a new sign of intimacy that the bird had begun to welcome. Within a second, the boy was asleep. That's what I need to do, said Abeka, but I have to get clean first. What do the riders do to wash?
Wait for rain, said Shu.
She looked up at the dark sky.
About 10 minutes.
Might as well just lie down then, mumbled Abeka, doing exactly that. Uraza came and stretched out next to her, paws set side by side on the ground, and head placed gently upon them. I hope Tariq and Lishay are all right, whispered Maylin. She edged closer to Rolan and G, who was sitting next to him, apparently snoozing. But the panda shifted as Maylin sat down next to her and put out one heavy paw to rest it across the girl's leg. The contact sent a feeling of security and comfort through her, putting all her anxieties temporarily to rest. The next morning did not so much dawn as gradually steam into existence. The rain kept coming down, and the sun was not strong enough to break through. Everyone woke cramped, uncomfortable, and wet. The riders had kept the big fires going all night, despite the rain. But as Maylin soon discovered, there wasn't much point trying to dry out next to them. One side would get less damp, while the other was as drenched as ever. Breakfast came from the riders, who offered small cakes of rice mixed with some kind of mushroom. After they had eaten and sorted themselves out for the day, the Greencloaks gathered together at the rock to discuss what they should do. In the absence of Tariq, Everyone looked to Shu, but the old woman refused to talk.
I'm on holiday from the Green Cloaks,
she said, taking up her pack and disappearing into the outer circle of rhino riders.
Got to sell some pots.
We should go and find Tariq and Lachey, said Abeka. Maylin shook her head, even though her fears regarding the elder Greencloaks had returned on waking. We should go to Dinesh right away and convince him to give us his talisman, she said. The conquerors are already in the swamp, and there are a lot more of them cutting away through the great bamboo maze to the north, where I left my father. We might only be a few days ahead of them.
Maylin's right,
said Rolan. He was much better. The rash was completely gone, though he still looked weak.
Sure, but perhaps we should try to find Tariq and Lachey first, said Connor.
Jodha Bodha sent riders to look for them, said Maylin. They would want us to go on.
Where are we going to exactly? Asked Connor. Has anyone spoken to Jodha Bodha this morning?
He and the others looked around for him, craning their necks.
There he is, said Rolan. Over near that fire.
They moved as a group through the camp. Jodha Bodha turned to face them as they approached.
Our guests are anxious to depart, I see, he said.
We need to get to Dinesh before the conquerors, said Maylin. But have your riders found Tariq and Lachey?
We will soon know.
Jodha Bodha held out his hand and gestured toward the jungle trail. A line of rhino riders was coming into the clearing. Several of the rhinos were riderless and had bodies strapped across their backs. Dead bodies. Jodha Bodha's beard quivered as the muscles of his jaw tensed. His eyes narrowed in anger. For a moment, all the Greencloaks held their breath. But at the end of the line of rhinos, two familiar figures were walking together, an otter on the man's shoulder and a tiger at the woman's side. Maylin felt a surge of relief.
Together, your friends and mine have fought many poisoned crocodiles, such as those you spoke of last night,
said Jodha Bodha, quickly taking the measure of the situation.
The conquerors will regret the day they brought this bile into our lands.
You mean you'll fight with us against them? Asked Maylin, wondering if she could convince him to send reinforcements to her father as well. Jodha Bodha shook his head, disappointing her.
We fight alone, as we have always done, but we will not let the conquerors trespass.
Do you fight alone, yourself, when confronted by a foe too strong?
Asked Shu, appearing from behind a crowd of rhino riders, who were all holding new frying pans.
Or do you call on your riders?
Jodha Bodha laughed. You never give up, do you? You know our traditions are as solid as the rhino rock.
Shu sniffed and muttered,
Hidebound.
Tariq and Lachey hurried over as the leader of the rhino rider patrol rode up and began talking quickly to Jodha Bodha.
Rolan,
said Tariq. He looked muddy but unharmed. Lachey had a blood-stained bandage tied around her upper arm.
You look better. I knew that Abeka and Connor could get the banana gourds.
Tariq saw Shu and gawped for a moment, then bowed.
You must be Shu,
he said.
I am Tariq.
And I, Lachey. It is an honor to meet a famous Greencloak of,
the past?
Asked Shu. I was going to say, of your reputation, said Lachey.
Are you joining us?
Asked Tariq.
We could use your wisdom and advice.
Not just yet, said Shu. I still have pots to sell to some folk up north.
Oh,
said Tariq, obviously disappointed. He turned to Jodha Bodha.
The riders tell me that they will take us to the Lake of the Elephant. We must go now. Jodha Bodha, how far is it? Less than a day's ride, said Jodha Bodha. I will send a patrol, and you will ride with them. But tell me, where are the poisoned crocodiles and the conquerors now? All over the swamp, I hope, said Tariq. We led them in many different directions. splitting them up and attacking the smaller groups. They even attacked each other once, last night. But they will gather again, and there are other mad animals, not just the crocodiles. Whatever this poison is.
Becca thinks it's the bile, Connor offered. The substance Zerif mentioned that gives the conquerors their spirit animals.
Becca nodded. When I was with the conquerors, I saw them transforming innocent animals with it.
You've seen what the conquerors will do, said Shu. All the free peoples are needed to stop them.
And the talismans of the great beasts, said Tariq. I fear that the conquerors may already be at the Lake of the Elephant. The way there is hidden, said Jodabodda. They will not find it. Come, eat food, and clean and dress your wounds. The patrol will leave as soon as you are ready.
We're really going to ride rhinos? Asked Connor excitedly.
You say that as though it's a good thing, said Roland with a worried look. Maylin, remembering how bad he was at riding horses, was unable to suppress a laugh.
Chapter 17. Lake of the Elephant. The way into the Lake of the Elephant was well hidden. The rhino riders took the green cloaks from the clearing along a path that gradually rose up a lengthy ridge, the jungle getting denser the higher they went. Eventually, the path became more of a green tunnel, with the trees growing completely over the top and stitching themselves together with vines. Roland wasn't enjoying the ride. The rhinos, although smaller than their Niloan counterparts, were still very broad, and the Turgesh didn't use saddles themselves. For their passengers, they had simply tied a rope around the rhino's middle. Roland was holding onto his rope with one hand and the rider with the other, and simultaneously trying to grip the rough hide with his legs. But it was very difficult. He was feeling much better, but it still took all his energy to stay on. Several times his rider asked politely for him to stop clinging so tightly.
I'm only holding on so tight because I'm worried your rhino will be embarrassed if I fall off, said Roland.
The others seemed to be enjoying it. Connor whooped every time his rhino lumbered over a fallen log, and Abeka had even been allowed to swap places with her rider to hold the chain that guided her rhino along the path. Only Maylin rode silently. Roland wondered if she was displaying less enthusiasm than the others in order to make him feel better. The climb up the ridge seemed to take forever, but eventually they began to descend again, and Roland stopped fearing that he would slip off into the mud. Halfway down, the lead rider took an even more overgrown side path, which was only just wide enough for the rhinos to pass between the ancient, massive trees. The ground became rockier, less muddy and wet, and there were fewer ferns and vines. Another mile or so farther on, the path approached a rock face. The lead rhino reached it and disappeared. Roland, who was on the next rhino, gasped and craned over the shoulder of his rider, wondering why they were still pressing on. Had the lead rider fallen into a hole? Then he saw that there were actually two lines of cliff, one shielding the other. The lead rhino had turned into the narrow path between the two cliff faces, a path that led steeply down into dark shadows.
How far's the lake now? Roland asked his rhino rider. Are we almost there? The lake lies ahead, still some distance. That was what the rider always said. And will you wash the rhinos when you get there? He asked, unable to resist a little dig in response. Rhinos do not bathe, said the rider. Their scent sets fear in the hearts of our enemies. I bet. Roland screwed up his nose.
It was very dark on the steep path downward. The trail was little more than 10 feet wide between the two rock faces, and the rocky walls were at least 200 feet high. The sun shone overhead, but little of the light made its way down to the canyon floor. The path descended for some time, but then started to climb again. The rhinos snorted as they labored up the trail, which became steeper and steeper. Their powerful muscles flexed without any sign of fatigue. But even as the path rose up, so did the cliff sides, stretching higher still. After several hours, Roland thought they must have climbed at least 2,000 feet. There was still no sign the path would eventually lift them out of the crack between the cliffs. At least the air had become a little less warm and humid, a welcome change after the steam of the jungle. Finally, the path began to widen out, or rather, the cliffs on either side drew back. The rhinos spread out to march in pairs, side by side, and then 4 abreast, and finally, all 8 rhinos extended out into a line. At that point, the cliff walls on either side suddenly began to grow smaller, and in the space of a few hundred yards, they dwindled to nothing. The ground opened up to reveal a lake ahead, a vast pool of beautiful blue water, not at all like the muddy swamp. The lake occupied a crater of some kind, perhaps a dormant volcano, and in the middle of it there was an island with a step pyramid of grey stone built upon it. There appeared to be a dome on the top. The rhino riders galloped their beasts down to the lake shore and brought them to a stop in a great cloud of blown-up sand. As it cleared, Maylin suddenly fell off her rhino. She lay on the ground, stunned for a moment, looking up at the sky. Then she slowly got to her feet and stared around her at the crater walls, the island and the sky.
Maylin, are you all right?
Connor was the first to leap from his own rhino, with Rebecca and Roland close behind. Maylin didn't answer immediately. She kept looking around, her eyes glassy. She was clearly dazed by the fall. Roland took her shoulders and tried to sit her down, but as he did so, she suddenly stepped back and thrust her arms up and out, breaking his gentle hold. "What are you doing?" she said, suddenly alert and in the present once more.
"Helping you," he said. "You fell off the rhino."
"I fell off?" asked Maylin. She shook her head slightly. "I guess I was asleep."
"Outsiders often fall off," said the rhino rider who had been carrying Maylin. "On the rare occasions we let them ride with us. Luckily, you fell at the end of the ride."
Maylin blinked and shook her head again. "I'll be all right," she said. "Have we arrived?"
"This is the Lake of the Elephant," said the rider. "We have brought you here, as Jodaboda promised. Now we must return."
The other Greencloaks slid off the rhinos' backs, took up their packs, and waved goodbye as the rhino riders remounted and set off. Roland hadn't enjoyed the experience of being a rhino rider, but he wished they weren't leaving so soon. He felt vulnerable on the lake shore. "I presume the island is where we need to go," said Lichet. Essex flew overhead, issuing a long, falling cry as she set out to inspect the way ahead. G, who had chosen to travel in the dormant state, emerged with a flare of light and looked calmly out across the lake at the central island. Briggan paced along the shore, studying it with his clear blue eyes. Josur and Uraza tumbled out of their dormant states and briefly played some kind of cat tag until Josur grew tired of it and gave up. Lumio, who had ridden the whole way on Tariq's shoulder, slid down his arm and went to inspect the water. But rather than slipping into it, as he normally did when finding a pleasant stream or lake, he backtracked away, letting out a strange hissing noise.
"Lumio?"
asked Tariq. He drew his sword and warily approached the lake's edge. Before he could get within a foot of the shore, a snakehead lunged up out of the clear water, needle teeth snapping at him. With a shout, Tariq slashed at it. 2 wriggling pieces fell onto the shore, which Tariq kicked back into the water. A second later, the lake boiled and frothed as dozens of other snakeheads ripped the dead one apart and ate it.
"We should have brought some of those fish traps from Shinkao Dai," said Roland.
"We won't be swimming across," said Lichet, "and there are no trees to cut down for a raft." There was nothing useful at all around, as far as Roland could see. The lake was about a mile in diameter, and was completely surrounded by the rocky crater wall. The only way in was behind them, through the path that wound its deep, narrow way through the mountain. Roland blinked, and suddenly his vision was clearer, containing more colours than he was used to. His improved vision was coming from Essex. This was the second time it had happened in such a short period, and it was no less amazing than the first.
There are people, at least I think they're people, on the island,
said Roland, shading his eyes and peering across the water.
They've got weird heads, way too big for their bodies. There are 3 of them watching us. Look near the middle of the pyramid, at the bottom.
The others all looked. They too could see the 3 small figures, but it was too far away for them to make out who or what they were. They stood near the base of the pyramid, looking back at the Greencloaks for a while, then turned and disappeared somewhere inside the structure.
There must be a boat or something hidden somewhere along here, said Abeka. Over there, the crater wall looks different.
Yes, I see it,
said Tariq. About 100 yards away, there was a stretch of the crater wall that looked smooth, as if the stone had been worked.
Let's go take a look.
It was clear the crater rim wall had been not only smoothed, but also deeply carved with an intricate design. In it, an elephant wading through a river or lake raised its trunk to spray water in the air.
Subtle, said Roland. I think we've definitely found the Lake of the Elephant.
It might be more than that, said Maylin.
She moved closer to the stone and ran her fingers along the carved lines.
Some of these are cut much deeper. I wonder.
She stepped back to get a wider view, her eyes following the deep marks, which were darker on the stone.
There's a door, she said. Look, follow the deep lines. They go up that leg, across the body, down the back leg, and then along the lake. And there's a line in the middle as well. It's a rectangle cut in the middle. Double doors.
Maybe, said Connor, scratching his head. Tight-fitting doors, if they are. How do you get them open?
I don't know that, replied Maylin.
Yet.
Secret doors are often activated by pushing or pulling something, said Tariq. Well spotted, Maylin.
What about its eye? Said Connor. That sticks out a lot more than anything else. We could try to push it in. I could jump up and kick it, said Abeka.
Wait, said Roland. There might be a trap. Maybe the eye is too obvious. We should try and poke it with a stick from the side, not from in front.
I could do that with my staff, said Maylin. If I stand over here...
Everyone, get well back, said Tariq.
Maylin waited until they were all clear, then climbed up near the elephant carving. She leaned across and extended her staff as far as she could, until it pressed against the eye. It moved, depressing several inches. There was a loud click, and a dozen arrows shot out from holes disguised in the carving. If Abeka had jumped to kick the eyeball, she would have been hit for sure.
I guess Dinesh really doesn't want visitors, said Roland.
If it's not the eye, then what else could trigger it to open?
Mused Abeka. She walked in front of the door and looked again. But nothing else was immediately obvious. Not until Lumio suddenly straightened up on Tariq's shoulder and chittered something in his ear.
Of course,
said Tariq. He pointed to a tiny carving, smaller than his thumb, in the water the elephant was standing in, just near its tail.
A boat. Looks more like a banana gourd, said Roland, or a squashed insect.
Those are oars, not legs, said Connor. It is a boat.
I can probably press it from the other side, said Maylin. She scrambled up the crater wall on the right-hand side of the carving. Roland went with her, while everyone else retreated to what they hoped were safe positions. The staff was extended. It was a long reach, and the staff was heavy. Despite her best efforts and Roland's encouragement, Maylin couldn't stop the end from waving around so much that she couldn't touch the tiny boat. "Gee," she called, "come and help me." The panda ambled over and sat down below Meilin. Meilin took a deep breath in and out and grew still all over. Roland had never seen her look so, not relaxed, but rather composed, as though all the drive and urgency had left her for a moment, leaving her at a still point he could only envy. With perfect focus, Meilin reached out once more with her staff. It was steady in her hands, and she guided it exactly onto the tiny carving of the boat. A deep rumbling sounded inside the crater wall. Dust fell from the elephant carving, and the two halves of the door slowly lowered forward, like a drawbridge opening. "Wait," cautioned Tariq as Connor moved to go inside. A 40-foot-long boat came rolling out, propelled by hidden mechanisms within the cave. It was made of tightly woven reeds, with its long mast lying flat along its length, and oars shipped, mounted on a carriage that ran across the lowered bridge toward the lake. Roland dropped down the crater wall and ran after it, grabbing at the ropes that trailed behind to bring it to a stop before it hit the water, and drifted off without them. Chapter 18. The Island Pyramid. Once Roland had caught the boat and the others had helped pull it back up the shore, it was easy to get it in the water and climb aboard. Everyone was very careful to climb in over the stern and not step into the water, which made it a little difficult to push the craft off the shore. Once on the lake, the lightness of its construction and lack of a keel also meant the boat was easily caught by the wind, so it needed 4 of them rowing all the time just to keep it going roughly toward the island. As the oars dipped in and out of the water, snakeheads snapped at them. "There is a strong current," said Tariq, who was managing the steering oar. He looked around the crater rim. "There must be a river coming in somewhere." "There," said Roland, pointing. He was acting as a lookout in the bow, while the others rowed. There was a patch of darkness low on the northern crater wall. Essex, on his shoulder, shrieked in confirmation. "Another way in," said Tariq thoughtfully, "for things like crocodiles." "At least we got here first," said Meilin. "Maybe we can get the talisman and be gone before Zarif and the conquerors even work out where we are," said Connor. "Their seer is very powerful," said Abeka, looking around her. "Getting in and out unhindered might be too much to hope for." Those big-headed people are coming out of the pyramid again," said Roland, sounding as nervous as Abeka felt. "Oh, they've got elephant heads. Wait, that can't be right." "Don't stop rowing," called Tariq, as everyone turned around to look. "They're just masks." They've got bows," said Roland. "We'll be in range very soon." "Abeka, Lichet, take up your bows," said Tariq. "I only have 3 arrows left," said Abeka. "One of them is bent." "I have 5, said Lichet. "There are 20 of the elephant heads," said Roland. "They've all got bows. They're knocking arrows." "Rowers, back water," said Tariq. "We'll try to parley with them. Roland, take the steering oar." Tariq and Roland swapped ends, Tariq putting one foot up on the boat's elephant figurehead, one of the only wooden parts of the reed ship. He cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted, "We are Green Cloaks, come to visit Dinesh." One of the elephant heads took off a mask, revealing a middle-aged woman with grey painted skin. "The elephant does not want visitors. Turn back." "We must see Dinesh," shouted Tariq. "It is of vital importance." "Turn back," shouted the woman. "We will shoot." "If you shoot, we must fight you," roared Tariq. "We don't want that. We are Green Cloaks.
We are marked, and we have spirit animals. You will all be killed.
Turn back!
No, we must talk to Dinesh.
The woman put her elephant head back on and lowered her arm. Immediately, the others fired, arrows arcing toward the boat.
Backwater!
Ordered Tariq. He stood where he was, watching the flight of the arrows. When they reached the peak of their trajectory, he drew his sword, ready to cut the projectiles from the air. But he didn't need to, as they fell short.
Abeka, shoot at the one who spoke, said Tariq. Aim for the legs. We don't want to kill anyone unnecessarily.
Abeka and Lishay stood by the rail, bending their knees to compensate for the slight roll of the boat. Left leg for me, said Lishay, below the knee. I'll try for her right, said Abeka, aiming carefully. They shot at the same time, their arrows flying in a much flatter arc than the elephant head arrows. A loud scream announced they had hit something, and a moment later the spokeswoman fell to the ground. 4 other elephant heads hastily dropped their bows and picked her up, carrying her inside the pyramid.
And then there were 15,
said Connor. Tariq cupped his hands and shouted again.
We don't want to fight you. Let us land and speak to Dinesh.
The only answer was another shower of arrows. Tariq chopped 2 of them out of the air, and Maylin deflected another with her quarterstaff.
Shoot 2 more in the legs, sighed Tariq. If only they had some sense.
They don't know who we are, said Maylin. They probably think we're the conquerors.
A 6 people in a raft, said Rolan. Though I suppose we could be scouts.
Abeka and Lishay shot again. This time, 6 people helped each of the wounded inside, leaving only 3 archers behind. They bravely stood their ground until Lishay and Abeka began to draw their bowstrings back. Then they made the sensible decision to retreat inside before any more arrows could be loosed in their direction.
Quickly, row in before they come back with reinforcements, said Tariq.
Their range is short because their bows are inferior, said Lishay. Do not assume that these are their only weapons. All we have to do is talk to them, said Abeka. She hadn't liked firing at people who couldn't hit her back. I am sure they will see reason.
Who are they?
Asked Connor.
Priests, I would guess,
said Tariq.
Serving Dinesh as a divine being. It has happened often with the great beasts, although they don't encourage it, usually.
There was a wooden quay on the island, in front of the pyramid. They moored the boat there and went ashore cautiously, weapons ready. But no elephant heads remained in view, and the huge bronze doors at the foot of the pyramid were firmly closed. Roland sent Essex to fly around and see if there was another way in, while Tariq knocked firmly on the huge door.
We are green cloaks, he called out. Here to see Dinesh. We mean no harm.
There was no answer, and the huge doors did not open.
Didn't we just shoot 3 of them? Said Roland. No wonder they don't want to talk to... Wait.
Essex had swooped back and circled once over his head before taking off again.
Something about the top of the pyramid, said Roland. I think maybe Essex has found another way in. Well done.
Tariq started to climb up, followed by Maylin, Abeka, Roland and Connor, with Lishay at the rear, all but Roland with their spirit animals dormant. The pyramid was built in a series of steps or tiers, each one about 4 feet high. It was difficult, but not impossible, for Abeka to haul herself up onto the next level. There were 39 steps, Abeka calculated. Not too many to wear Roland out in his recovering state, she hoped. On the 4th step he faltered, and Connor reached down a hand to help him. Roland took it, nodding in gratitude. Tariq was on the 15th step when he stopped for a rest and looked out across the lake.
Look, over there.
There were dark shapes in the clear waters of the lake, coming out at the spot where the underground river flowed in. Dozens and dozens of them, massive things under the water. Crocodiles, said Abeka. The conquerors must be using them to attack. But surely the snakeheads will... She faltered, seeing sudden flurries in the water. Smaller darting shapes were attacking the larger ones, sending up a frothy spray tinged with pink. But they didn't last long. The crocodiles could kill several snakeheads with one snap of their jaws, and the sharp teeth of the carnivorous fish had trouble penetrating the croc's armoured hides. A few of the smaller ones floated dead to the surface, but plenty more snakeheads kept on coming, pushing through the mashed-up remains of hundreds of others. It was telling that the crocs were so affected by the bile that they didn't stop to eat the dead fish.
"There are people on the crater wall," said Roland. "Soldiers."
"And spirit animals," said Connor, shielding his eyes. "It looks like the conquerors."
Abeka could just make out lines of soldiers who were throwing ropes down the sides of the inner crater wall. "But how did they find this place?" Maylin shook her head. "I don't know. I think they're the same ones I saw attacking my father. But to get here so quickly, they must have come the same way I did, through the maze."
"I hope Essex really has found a way into the temple," said Tariq grimly. "Come on!"
They raced to the top now, helping each other up. But when at last they reached the summit and the base of the dome they found there was no obvious door. Just the dome, which appeared to be one huge boulder of pitted grey stone, much, much larger than any of the blocks that had built the rest of the pyramid. It towered over them, covered with strange sweeping marks and lines, almost like a map of the world.
"Are you pulling our legs, Essex?" chided Roland. "If the entrance is under that thing, we're never going to."
Essex's retort was indignant from where she circled the dome above them.
"I don't get it,"
said Roland to the others, looking apologetic on behalf of his spirit animal.
"I'm sure she's telling us that the way in is right here somewhere."
"We need to find it soon," said Maylin. "Those crocs are halfway across the lake, and they're big enough to climb up here."
"Maybe Briggan can find a way,"
said Connor. He called the wolf, who appeared in a flash of light. He immediately went to the huge boulder, sniffed it, and sat down.
"Briggan says it's here too,"
said Connor, mystified.
"I mean, that's not it exactly. It's more a kind of sense of having arrived where we wanted to go."
He moved back from the dome and looked at it speculatively. Roland joined him, Essex still calling out what sounded like falcon for bad words above his head. Abeka called Uraza, who looked up at her in puzzlement, as though not understanding why the humans couldn't see something obvious. "So show us," Abeka said. "What are we missing?" Uraza loped forward until she was directly in front of the dome. Raising both front paws, she raked her claws down the side of the stone. Sparks danced from the stone, and a faint curl of what looked like smoke. There came a great rumble that shook the entire pyramid, and a flurry of movement as everyone jumped, dropped, or half fell onto the next step down. Uraza backed hastily away and looked up expectantly. "Another booby trap," thought Abeka. What if the dome were to collapse, destroying the temple they were standing on? She scrambled backwards so quickly she fell over. When she tried to stand, Uraza coiled through her legs, making her fall over again. She stared upward in horror, then amazement, as the huge boulder slowly rose above her and began to uncurl, the mysterious lines in its stone flank widening and becoming the gap between limbs and an enormous body. First, there was a questing trunk, as long as the trunk of the mightiest tree in the jungle. Then one massive foot, and then another, planting themselves firmly on the highest step of the pyramid, and lifting. Suddenly, a massive elephant was standing above them, making everything below seem small. With thundering steps, it shifted position so its fierce eyes could look down on the green cloaks from above. tusks that were easily 12 yards long and looked very sharp, swayed from side to side, hissing through the air.
"What do I have to do to be left alone?"
roared Dinesh the elephant. Chapter 19. Dinesh. Maylin was the first to find her voice. Roland's throat was closed tight, not just by the dust Dinesh's appearance had raised, but by the fear of being crushed under one of those terrible feet, or skewered on a tusk, or swept in by that mighty trunk and swallowed whole. "We do not disturb your rest lightly," Maylin said with a deep bow. "The crocodiles are creatures poisoned by the conquerors, who serve the new devourer. We are ambassadors from the Greencloaks, companions of the Four Fallen, and we need your help." With that, she released Chi onto the step beside her. Leopard and Wolf loped to join the panda, while Falcon swooped low overhead and then screeched away. Dinesh leaned down, an unnerving action given his enormous size. The pyramid groaned under his weight. Roland was sure he felt the stones shifting beneath his feet.
"Yes, I see G as your companion, and there is Uraza, who woke me from my quiet contemplation, and Essex, aloof as ever, and Briggan, wanting to bite someone, no doubt. I have not missed them. They are small, but I suppose they might grow."
"Time is short, Dinesh," said Tariq. "We are beset upon by not only crocodiles, but also an army, with many spirit animals. They will take rather than talk."
"Take? Take what?"
"Your talisman, Dinesh," said Roland, finding his voice. "The slay elephant."
"I see,"
rumbled Dinesh.
"That would not be easily taken. It is what you have also come for, is it not?"
"It is," said Abeka. "We need it to fight the devourer."
"You say the devourer has also come again?"
asked Dinesh.
"Are Kovo and Gerathon released from their prisons?"
"We do not know," said Tariq, "but the enemy has overrun many lands, and agents of the devourer seek all the talismans. They have the iron boar already."
"And you have the granite ram,"
said Dinesh, his eyes bright on Abeka, as if he could sense the talisman on her. "We need your talisman desperately," said Connor. "If you give it to us, we might still be able to—"
"Get away from these crocodiles and soldiers?"
asked Dinesh. "Use it to fight them," said Abeka.
"Ah, I misjudged you,"
said Dinesh. The huge elephant sighed and looked out at the approaching crocodiles and the northern crater wall, which was now swarming with soldiers. There were rope ladders all along the crater rim, and many ropes. There were also boats being lowered, long, light canoes that must have been carried for miles through the great bamboo maze, and then the jungle. "Will you give us your talisman?" asked Connor quietly. The elephant shifted with a sound of rock grinding against rock.
"It is no small thing you ask," he said. "The great beasts and our talismans. We are two sides of one thing, fruit of the same tree. To give up our talismans is to give up something of ourselves. But then, I suppose we must all face the time for change, when it comes, in our different ways. Even when we try to escape it, like Suka in her tomb of ice. Though in her case, I am not sure avoidance was her intention."
"Suka the polar bear?" asked Tariq. "She is entombed in ice?"
"Yes, at least that was the last I heard of her. I have not kept up with my fellows. I have not kept up with the world."
"Now the world is coming to you,"
whether you like it or not," said Roland. "In about 5 minutes, there are going to be hundreds of those bile creatures swarming up here, and an army of enemies not long after that. So are you going to give us the slate elephant or not?" "I will let fate choose for me," mused Dinesh. "Let us see who is alive by the end of the day. But I am inclined to help you at least a little. I will tell the people who have decided to be my priests to fight with you, to make it a little less one-sided."
The massive elephant stood up on his hind legs, an incredible sight. He lifted his trunk and trumpeted a call that echoed across the crater, and probably for miles beyond. Then he curled up again at the top of the pyramid, his skin darkening and turning to stone, and once more became a giant, impenetrable dome. But his trumpet call still echoed around the crater, or so it seemed, until the listeners realized they were hearing answering calls as well. Faint horn blasts came from the narrow path between the cliffs, accompanied by the clash of Zhongyi's gongs. But the Greencloaks had no time to wonder what this meant. They were jumping down the pyramid, running for the great bronze gate, even as the first of the bile-grown crocodiles came sliding ashore. Roland lagged slightly behind, still feeling winded from the ascent. He could see 3 waves converging on the same spot, him and the others with their spirit animals. The crocodiles, whipping through the water with powerful swishes of their bile-fueled tails, and Dinesh's priests. He worried that the crocodiles would reach the gate before anyone else, but it was the Greencloaks who got there first, turning at the last moment to face their enemies. Tariq's and Lichay's spirit animals exploded out to join them, ready for combat. Dinesh's priests rushed forward to stand at their sides. The priests were now clad in chainmail. Their bulbous paper elephant heads had been replaced by sleek steel helmets with thin, dagger-like tusks. They carried long spears and swords, and pointed knives hung from their belts. With a series of brisk commands, they arrayed themselves in front of the gates, smoothly assimilating the Greencloaks into their defensive wall. The first wave of crocodiles struck in a fury of muscle and teeth. Most went down quickly, spitted on spears, stabbed by Tariq's sword, and shot with elephant priests' arrows, snatched up by Abeka and Lichay. Those that got through were chopped with Connor's axe, bitten by Briggan, and stabbed in the eyes by Roland. Uraza and Josur prowled the fringes of the battle, savaging anything that survived. Despite this, one particularly large croc almost managed to get past the defenders, only to be distracted by Lumio, snapping after the otter so wildly it almost tied itself in a knot. As it tried to disentangle its tail from its legs, Connor's axe came down on its head. The second wave was only minutes behind, but it gave Tariq a brief time to organize the defenses.
"Shut the gates,"
he commanded, throwing himself against one of the massive bronze doors. It slowly groaned forward until he was joined by 6 elephant priests who pushed it swiftly closed. Clanging shut, huge locking bars automatically fell into position.
"Are there arrow ports?"
asked Tariq.
"Yes,"
said a tall priest, sliding back several panels at chest height.
"Lichay, Abeka, shoot through those," said Tariq.
He looked around the huge central chamber. There were at least 40 armed and armoured elephant priests there, but another dozen or so were still in their grey robes, gathered around a huge bronze wheel that stuck out of the far wall.
"What's that wheel?"
"It opens the water gate," said one of the unhelmeted priests. He looked younger than most of the others, and seemed more alert, less confused by the sudden change in what must have been a quiet and orderly existence up until that day. "To drain the lake."
"How quickly does it do that?"
asked Tariq.
"We do not know," said the priest. "It's a defense of last resort. It has never been done before." "If it's fast enough, it will take the enemy's boats away," said Connor. "Suck them under."
Tariq nodded.
"Is there anywhere to see out from above? We need to know if the conquerors have launched their boats."
The priest pointed to a stairway on the left.
There are disguised viewing ports at every step, he said, but once opened, they might be spotted from outside.
Rolan, go see what the enemy is doing,
said Tariq. Rolan hurried up the stairs as the bronze doors rang out with the sudden impact of massive crocodiles throwing themselves against the gate. Connor came with him. Abeka and Lishay began to shoot steadily through the arrow ports, taking careful aim with each shot. Without being asked, elephant priests brought them quivers full of new arrows. Rolan was panting by the time he reached the 4th level. Connor joined him at the viewing port, and together they squinted out across the lake. Neither of them needed Essex's falcon sight to take stock of the forces arrayed below.
They're on the lake,
Connor called back down, since Rolan was still breathless.
And there's a huge, really huge crocodile driving the other ones ahead of it.
The Devourer himself must be here,
they heard Tariq say. Someone gasped.
If we could defeat him, said Connor, that might finish the war right here.
Rolan blinked at his friend. It seemed to him a bit optimistic when they were outnumbered 1,000 to 1, with a truly giant crocodile on the warpath, and who knew what other bile-created spirit animals? They hurried back down the steps to ground level, where the very same conversation was taking place.
Did you see anyone coming through the cliff path?
Maylin asked Rolan and Connor.
Rhino riders or Zhongyi's forces?
No,
said Rolan, panting.
Just thousands and thousands of conquerors swarming over the crater wall with hundreds of boats. Are there many on the water already?
Asked Tariq.
A third, maybe more, said Connor.
Open the water gate,
commanded Tariq. The priests at the huge bronze wheel gripped it and tried to turn it, some pulling and some pushing. But it refused to budge. The gate rang out again, the bars groaning as they held against another attack by enraged crocodiles.
They're throwing themselves at the gate in a frenzy. They're totally mad,
shouted Abeka, taking up another arrow and firing it.
I've shot this one 12 times, and it's still attacking.
Everyone but Abeka and Lishay to the wheel, ordered Tariq. You priests, stand back.
Connor and Briggan, Rolan and Essex, Maylin and G, and Tariq and Lumio raced over to the huge wheel.
Take hold and call upon the strength of your spirit animal, said Tariq.
Everyone heaved, but the wheel still wouldn't budge. Behind them, the huge doors rang again as the crocodiles rammed into it, this time with an alarming cracking sound from the bars that held it closed.
The gate's breaking, shouted Lishay.
Heave!
The wheel still did not move.
Gee, help me,
called out Maylin. G lumbered up onto her hind legs and ponderously approached the wheel, laying her paws down on one of the thick spokes. Rolan had heard about the strength the panda had displayed in the great bamboo maze, but he had never seen it in action.
Everyone, now,
called out Maylin. Rolan shut his eyes and pushed against the wheel with all his strength, as everyone around him exerted every scrap of muscle and determination. There was a sound like gravel crunching, as the rust that had locked the wheel in place disintegrated. It started to move, slowly at first, and then more swiftly, until it was spinning almost of its own accord.
Rolan, go and see if this has done anything, ordered Tariq.
As he spoke, one of the bars that held the gate splintered and broke, leaving only one beam of wood holding the doors shut.
Everyone else, prepare to receive the enemy.
Abeka and Lishay jumped aside as the last bar snapped. A hideous, red-eyed crocodile charged through the gap and was immediately set upon by elephant priests with their spears. More crocs came behind, sending the bronze doors crashing open. They were met by a charge from Tariq and the others. The inside of the pyramid was a vicious battle, with everyone screaming and crocs smashing into stone in their frenzy. Rolan ran back up the stairs, calling Essex's name. He didn't stop to look out through any of the lower viewports, racing up to the 8th step, which he knew would give an even better view over the lake. Hastily sliding it open, he looked out. The enemy armada was halfway across the lake, heading toward the island. Hundreds of canoe-like boats were already on the water, with at least as many being launched. He couldn't see the giant crocodile, though, which was alarming, and there didn't appear to be anything happening to the lake, at least not on the northern side. Roland shut the port and ran around the walkway to the eastern side. He looked out. Their only chance was if a strong enough current sucked the boats down and took the soldiers and their spirit animals with them. Again, there was nothing. Roland ran to the southern side. Essex screeched above his head and plummeted down into view, landing several feet short of the viewport. Roland felt a now familiar rush of falcon sight that brought him too many details of the approaching horde, but still no sign of the devourer. There was something else, though. Something on the pyramid at Essex's feet, just outside the viewing port. The stone there was a slightly different colour from all the other blocks that made up the pyramid. It was a darker grey, actually closer to the real colour of Dinesh than the rest of the pyramid. And there was something carved on the surface. Roland reached through the viewing port and brushed the stone, Essex closely watching his every move. There was a small elephant, the size of his palm, carved into the grey stone. He traced it with his finger and, perhaps with too much daring, pushed against it. The carving popped out. There was a small grey elephant with a golden chain connected to its back. It was the slate elephant, the talisman. Roland's hand closed to pick it up, his thoughts racing. Now that they had it, they could try to escape, take the reed boat and run for the path through the cliff. They might make it, though it would be incredibly risky, even with the talisman. Dinesh's talisman. He hadn't given it to them. Roland had found it. Taking it now would be stealing, and did Roland really want a giant, angry elephant coming after him to get it back? He had stolen things in Concorba. He'd had to, simply in order to survive. But he didn't think of himself as a thief. He'd had a code that had stopped him going down a path that led many orphans just like him to becoming hardened criminals, or worse. Never take from the poor, never from the sick, and never if there was a better way. Didn't that apply here, too? Wouldn't it be better to earn it, rather than take it? His fingers itched. Dinesh was so powerful. Imagine what his talisman could do. Slowly, not at all certain he wasn't being a complete idiot, not daring to imagine what Mei Lin might say if she found out, Roland pushed the tiny elephant back in place. As it locked home, he heard a voice in his head.
"Good," said Dinesh. "If you had taken the talisman against my will, you would be my enemy. Since you have given it back, I will be your friend."
Essex nodded approvingly, and Roland sagged in relief. Thanks," said Roland, though he wasn't sure if Dinesh could hear him or if this mental speech only went one way. "How about being real friendly and helping us right now?" There was no response. Essex launched into air and flew to the next port. He ran after her and threw the cover open. Looking out, this time he was rewarded with a much better view. A circular hole had opened in the southern crater wall, a hole he estimated to be about 50 feet in diameter, though most of it was underwater. Water roiled and frothed near it, and a whirlpool was forming, showing that the lake was emptying out. But it wasn't emptying fast enough. The current wouldn't be strong enough to sweep the invading army away.
"Help is coming," said Dinesh. "Look to the west."
Chapter 20. Last Stand. Connor stepped back from the battleground, wiping his axe on his tunic as he recovered his breath. The crocodiles in the first 2 waves had all been killed. Greencloaks and elephant priests stood somberly among the carnage, checking weapons and wounds. Mei Lin helped bandage a badly bitten priest, with Ji gently licking at the wound.
"We cannot hold here with the gates broken like this," said Tariq to Lishay, who was cleaning some recovered arrows. "We will have to make a stand on the pyramid above, or run for the boat if the lake is not emptying too fast."
"We can't all fit on the boat,"
said Connor with a worried glance at the priests. After their awkward start approaching the island, they had fought well together. The priests didn't deserve to be left behind. But if they didn't take the boat, they might all die here. The conquerors would win, and the world of Erdos would be lost to the Devourer. Roland came racing down the stairs, completely winded.
"The lake is emptying," he panted, "but not fast enough. Enemy boats are halfway across."
He paused to suck in a breath.
"But there is good news. Rhino riders are coming down the cliff path, and there are Zhongyi soldiers too, under silver and crimson banners."
"Silver and crimson!" exclaimed Mei Lin. "My father!"
"I cannot think what would have brought them," said Tariq, "but now we have a chance."
"Shoo," said Connor. "I'll bet she called them."
"Did you see the Devourer?"
asked Tariq.
"Or his giant crocodile?"
Roland shook his head.
"How far away are the boats?"
"About 10 minutes, said Roland, but some were already turning aside to go back to shore, to prepare for the Rhino riders' attack.
"We'd better go and have a look," said Tariq. "Stay close, and be ready to retreat back here."
"Essex says that the way is clear," said Roland, his gaze turning distant. "If we go out now, we won't be surprised by that giant croc."
Connor glanced at Briggan, who was standing over a dead crocodile, as though daring it to wake up, and smiled contentedly. Even if they did die in battle today, he had experienced more than he had ever dreamed of while herding sheep. Tariq wiped his sword on his trouser leg. The others formed up behind him in a wedge. Josur and Uraza pounced ahead, one to either side, with Briggan stalking out in front. Ji gave the wounded priest one last lick and entered the dormant state as a tattoo on Mei Lin's arm. Together, they walked out into the sunshine, past the broken gates and the crocodiles outside, whose heads were stuck with so many arrows they looked like bizarre, oversized pincushions. Essex swooped low overhead with a shriek that made the priests start. The great host of the conquerors was still pouring over the crater wall, thousands of them, and it seemed nearly all had spirit animals. There were lynxes and cougars, jackals and boars, bears and hyenas, all kinds of animals swarming ahead of the soldiers. In the air above, there were bats and ravens, vultures and hawks. The lake was filling up with boats, although none had made it to the centre yet. The lake was also clearly shallower, the mark of its former level visible along the shore. But even though it was emptying, the current only sped the attackers' boats faster toward the island. On the western shore, the conquerors were forming up in ranks. A mile south, rhino riders swarmed from the cliff path, each one dropping a Zhongyi soldier from its back as they came out, the crimson lacquer on their armor bright as they ran into their tight formations. But even rhino riders and Zhongyis together were greatly outnumbered by the conquerors. "They'll be overwhelmed," said Mei Lin softly, looking at the Zhongyis. Connor wondered if she was remembering the fall of Jano Rion. "We all will be. There are just too many of them." Connor's heart sank. She was right. The hope that they had felt at the news of the arrival of the rhino riders and the Zhongyi soldiers was ebbing away.
"If you're going to help us," said Roland beside him, "now would be a very good time."
Connor turned to stare at his friend in puzzlement. Roland was looking away from the host, not toward it. Who are you talking to? Connor asked him.
Dinesh. He owes me, I think. Or maybe he was just...
Roland gripped Connor's shoulder as the island suddenly jolted beneath them. What was that? Connor looked down at the ground. It felt like an earthquake. Look! Roland was pointing up at the dome. It seemed to be rising higher above the top of the pyramid, as though Dinesh was stirring again. Then, Connor saw that the massive blocks in front of the dome were being pushed aside, as though the dome were the top of a giant sphere. A sphere that was starting to roll. "Run!" shrieked Roland. "Run left!" Everyone turned around and saw the now massively unbalanced sphere. It was almost half the size of the pyramid itself, and still moving forward, pushing through the stone blocks as though they were a child's bricks. It was about to burst free and roll down the remaining steps of the pyramid onto them. The ground shook violently as it crushed down the first step, grinding the stone into a ramp. The green cloaks and elephant priests fled toward the edge of the island. The boulder smashed down several more steps, straightening its path, and seeming to grow bigger as it approached. It was at least 100 feet in diameter. Connor didn't remember Dinesh being that big. Halfway down the pyramid, the massive boulder bounced into the air and came crashing down with a thud that knocked everyone off their feet. Then it bounced again. It rose high in the air, higher than any stone could normally bounce, and grew once more. Connor gaped as it soared overhead, impossibly high and huge at the same time. It was now the size of a tiny moon, a vast ball of stone that tumbled as it fell, straight at the enemy's fleet. The boulder struck the surface of the lake with incredible force, blowing most of the remaining water out of the lake in a single titanic splash. Boats, soldiers, spirit animals, crocodiles, everything exploded up into the air before coming down again in a torrent. Connor lay on the ground, shielding his head. He held his breath as water cascaded down all around them. A wave smashed against the island, its wash spreading all the way to the pyramid. But it was weaker than it might have been. Most of the water had gone up in the air. Connor was the first to stand up. He looked around anxiously for Briggan, fear stabbing at his heart. Then he saw him, crouching with the big cats, teeth bared. He shook all over, sending spray everywhere. The other spirit animals were all right, even Essex. The falcon was a black speck high above. Something flopped at Connor's feet. It was a snakehead, trying to bite him even as it gasped in the open air. He put it out of its misery with a quick stroke of his axe. From nearby came the trumpeting cry of an elephant. "Look!" cried Roland, pointing. The lake was now dry, the rocky bed exposed, covered in wounded conquerors and smashed boats. Right in the middle, the massive boulder that had caused the deluge uncurled, and there was Dinesh the elephant. He raised his trunk and trumpeted another war cry, but there were no enemies nearby to attack. Connor raised his axe above his head, but not in triumph, not yet. Things were different on the shore. The conquerors were advancing. Even with a good third of their number lost upon the lake, it was still a great host, marching inexorably toward the smaller forces of the rhino riders and the Zhongyi's resistance. The rhinos were closest to what had been the lakeshore, with the Zhongyi's foot soldiers forming up on the lower slopes of the crater wall. Down in the lake bed, Dinesh trumpeted again and began to lumber across toward the forthcoming battlefield. As he moved forward, there was a great blast of horns from the rhino riders. Connor saw Jodaboda raise his lance and bring it down, and all the rhino riders charged toward the enemy, the rhinos lowering their massive horned heads. The Greencloaks surged forward instinctively too, sprinting over the rocky bed to join in the battle. "Wait," said Tariq. "We must think before we fight. and stand together. Where can we make best use of our talents?
Connor knew where Mei Lin wanted to go. She was anxiously appraising the force of Zhongyi's resistance fighters, no doubt looking for her father.
"We might get trampled by the rhinos in a fight," he said. "It would be safer for us with General Teng."
Mei Lin glanced at him, as though surprised to hear him suggesting that plan. Her desire to agree was naked on her face, but with a brisk shake of her head and a hint of anguish in her eyes, she said, "My father doesn't need us. Dinesh is one against many. We should follow Dinesh and protect him."
Tariq nodded. "I agree. We follow Dinesh and stay together."
He ran swiftly forward, Lumio on his shoulder, lending him speed and agility over the exposed lake bed. The others followed as best they could, watching the rhinos on the other side surging into the conquerors, who had stopped to receive their charge, shields and spears at the ready. The clash of so many rhinos, spirit animals and soldiers and their weapons made a sound none of the Greencloaks had ever heard before. It was like a terrible shout of pain and anger from a metallic throat, louder than anything. A minute after the rhinos charged home, Dinesh joined the fray. Many conquerors ran before him, both spirit animals and people, but some were made of sterner stuff. Soon he was surrounded and had to turn in a circle, trumpeting and crushing, picking up enemies with his trunk and hurling them back against their allies. His tusks cut like scythes through the conqueror ranks, leaving wide swathes felled in their wake. The rhino riders found themselves surrounded too. Their charge had taken them deep into the enemy forces, but there were too many conquerors. They spread around and forward, cutting the rhino riders off from their allies, the Zhongyi's resistance fighters, on the crater wall. In response to this, a blast of battle gongs sounded from the resistance fighters, and Connor made out a tall man at the front, pointing his sword forward, catching the sunlight. Surely that was General Teng, giving the command to advance. Mei Lin's face lit up with pride, and Connor cheered as the well-disciplined Zhongyi soldiers marched forward, pausing every 10 yards or so to unleash a volley of arrows. Then it was time for Tariq and the others to enter the fight. They had reached the confused melee behind Dinesh, and Connor gripped his axe tightly with both hands, preparing himself for battle. Beside him, Brigand barked and snapped at the air, eager to get his teeth into the enemy. On the other side of the wolf, Roland grinned at him. "Together, right?" Connor grinned back. "Always." The sentiment was a fine one, but as they cut their way toward the elephant, almost immediately the press of battle began to force them apart. "Pair up!" shouted Tariq, as he dodged beneath the swipe of a huge soldier with a two-handed axe and cut at his arm, Lumio dancing around below, biting at the man's hamstrings to bring him down. As the enemy soldier fell, Josur jumped on him and bit him in the neck, before leaping across to savage a jackal that was trying to bite Li-Shay. Connor found himself back to back with Abeka, surrounded by enemies. They fought together as they had in the swamp, Brigand and Uraza at their sides. Connor and the two spirit animals kept the soldiers back with his axe, while Abeka coolly shot them. "They're faltering!" shouted Tariq. "Press on!" The conquerors were beginning to waver, and many were glancing over their shoulders. The ones between the rhino riders and the Zhongyi's fighters began to look for ways out, and some even started to surrender, throwing down their weapons. The battle was on a knife edge between defeat and victory. Anything could happen in the next few seconds. The whole future might be decided in that time. Hope suddenly rose in the hearts of the defenders as the conquerors felt their first real pangs of fear. Then a great crocodile, even larger than the others, came out of the lake bed. "I've seen that one before," gasped Abeka, pulling an arrow out of the body of a conqueror who had fallen at her feet. Connor wiped sweat from his forehead. "Is it?" "Yes, I saw it curled in front of the throne of the Devourer." Her expression was very fierce.
The Devourer, whispered Connor, and his words rang out in a sudden hush. All fighting had momentarily ceased, everyone looking at the giant crocodile in awe. A huge man stood up on the crocodile's back. He was armoured in red mail, with a fanged helmet that hid his face. "General Gar or not, I'll put an arrow in him just the same," said Abeka. The arrival of the crocodile and its rider put new heart in the conquerors. A cry went up, and they charged forward again. The battle swirled and shifted, small groups fighting in all directions, all order crumbling into chaos. Connor had lost sight of the other Greencloaks. He stayed close to Abeka. They fell into a rhythm that was only broken when a wolverine attacked Connor from behind while he was busy fending off a soldier. The first he knew of it was when sharp teeth fastened on his arm and shook it, wrenching the axe from his grasp. He cried out in pain and fell backward on one knee. Brigand snarled, but Abeka was closer. She moved to strike at the wolverine with an arrow, but at the last moment turned her hand to hit it with her fist. It fell away, and she backed off with her eyes and mouth wide. "Why'd you do that?" asked Connor, clutching his arm and feeling blood pulse under his fingers. He had seen her pull the blow, but why? He fumbled for his axe. Abeka was looking around her. Suddenly she froze. A lean figure stepped out of the soldiers toward them, a boy not much older than them, but stronger, blonder and whiter, even under the muck of battle. He caught sight of Abeka, and a flash of recognition went through both of them. Connor, just struggling to his feet with one hand on Brigand's back, saw it clearly. Abeka looked shocked, her dark skin paler than he had ever seen it. The blonde boy smiled and raised one hand in greeting. Abeka was still gaping at him when another enemy soldier brought his sword down toward her head. Connor leaped forward with a yelp, and the blow was blocked by the haft of his axe and by the thin, curved blade of a sabre. Connor's and the blonde boy's crossed weapons locked. Abeka blinked into the present and plunged the arrow in her hand deep into the enemy soldier's chest. Brigand jumped at the wolverine, biting savagely as it whipped around to attack again. With a squeal of steel, the blonde boy slowly disengaged his sword, watching Connor the whole time. "Rennig!" he called, and the wolverine made an odd coughing sound as it retreated. "Shane," Abeka said. "Abeka?" The blonde boy nodded sadly, but he didn't stick around to chat. He backed away and was carried off by the tide of battle. "Who was that?" panted Connor, swinging his axe to send several enemies scuttling after the boy. "Shane who?" "None of your business," snapped Abeka. Her face was flushed, and she was looking at neither Connor nor the retreating boy. "Ah," said Connor. He had wondered why Abeka had stayed with the conquerors as long as she had. The handsome boy, who had blocked his own soldier's attack to protect Abeka, might be that reason. They had some clear space around them now, with several soldiers withdrawing to follow Shane. 100 yards away, Connor could see that Tariq, Lishay, Maylin and Rolan had finally won their way to Dinesh. But the elephant was backing out of the combat, only striking or trampling anyone stupid enough to come after him. As Connor and Abeka pressed forward in hope of joining them, he turned.
"I judge the field to be even now, or close enough. It is for you to carry the day. Or not. I will await the victor."
With that, Dinesh tramped past them, the ground shaking as he went. The conquerors stood stunned for a moment as Dinesh retreated, unable to believe their luck. Then they surged forward, hundreds of them charging straight at the Greencloaks and their spirit animals, cutting off Abeka and Connor, with the giant crocodile and its rider coming up fast behind them. Chapter 21. A Great Loss.
Back to back, ordered Tariq. Maylin stepped into place with him, Lishay and Rolan. Their shoulders touched for a moment, then they found themselves pushed out a little as Maylin released G from her dormant state, the panda suddenly appearing between them. G stood upright, like a column, and they all set their backs against her solid bulk, feeling a wave of rejuvenation radiating out from her. Lumio crouched between Tariq's feet, but Josur snarled and sprang at the first attackers, while Essex tangled in midair with half a dozen enemy birds. Only her superior speed and dexterity saved her from their frenzied attacks. Within a minute, they were completely surrounded. Maylin whirled her staff almost too fast to be seen, letting well-practiced reflexes guide her blows. Tariq's straight sword flashed, and Lishay's curved tulwar sang as they cut and hacked at their opponents. Roland struck with his dagger, quick as Essex falling on a bird. Essex herself dove from above, seeking vulnerable eyes and throats. But there were too many enemies. Maylin knew it, and she was sure the others did too, although none of them said anything. There wasn't time to talk, and nothing to say anyway. It would only be a matter of minutes before one of them was wounded or killed. This was the end. Then, the enemies around them suddenly surged back, driven away by a charge led by a snorting rhino and a rider stabbing with his lance, and a soldier splendid in crimson and silver, with a badge on his helmet and a sword that shone like liquid silver as it struck. Close behind them were soldiers and rhino riders, fighting as if they had trained together for years. Maylin knew that badge. Her heart leaped on seeing it. "Father!" she cried.
"Jodaboda!"
shouted Rolan. General Teng saluted Maylin with his sword, then leaped back into the fight, Jodaboda and his rhino at his side. The enemy fell back before them, not expecting this last-minute resurgence. Many threw their weapons away as rhinos ran down their neighbours. The thundering of the mighty animals was as deafening as Dinesh himself. Maylin leaned back against G, watching her father fight. He was strong and efficient, a beacon of hope in her exhausted state. He kept pace with the rhinos, shouting orders. She longed to follow him, but they needed her there, just as the battle needed General Teng where he was. Suddenly, the giant crocodile and its rider raged through the line of retreating conquerors, crushing them under clawed foot without care. Jodaboda started to turn his rhino to meet it, but he couldn't get around in time. The huge jaws closed on the rhino's neck, and it fell. Jodaboda clung to the back of his falling beast an instant too long, unwilling to accept its death. Then he let go of the chain and leaped aside. But he fell badly. One leg twisted underneath him, and he did not get up. The crocodile pushed the dead rhino aside with its ugly snout and advanced on the wearied quartet. The man on its back drew a crescent-shaped blade from the scabbard on his chest and feinted at Tariq, who was closest. Tariq brought his sword up to block it, but the blade flew instead at Lishay, who was also leaning exhausted against G. She reacted too slowly. Josur leaped even as the blade flew. It struck the tiger with a horrifying thud, sinking deep into the beast's neck. Josur fell to the ground at Lishay's feet. The green cloak cried out, a terrible cry of pain and fear, and dropped to Josur's side, clutching the white fur in her fists. Maylin crouched next to her. Perhaps there was something G could do if they reacted quickly. But Josur had already been bleeding from a dozen lesser wounds before the blade had struck him. Maylin could tell before touching him that he was already dead. Lishay cried out again, a mournful wail of loss that broke Maylin's heart. Tariq snarled. She had never heard the green cloak make so animal a noise before. She looked up in surprise. He was already moving, springing forward, sword raised to strike the mammoth crocodile.
but the blow never connected. The crocodile swung its huge armoured head, sending him flying through the air to land in a crumpled heap. Lumio ran after him, chittering in distress. Maylin sprang to her feet and tried to run to his defence, but Roland pulled her back, just as the crocodile lunged, its jaws snapping shut in the air where Maylin would have been.
"Beware,"
cried a voice she knew well. Her father. Before the crocodile could attack again, its snout was struck by a flurry of blows from General Teng. Sparks flew from its strange hide, but so did small amounts of blood.
"Maylin, get back,"
ordered Teng. His sword flashed again, knocking another thrown crescent blade aside. The crocodile snapped at him, but he bent over backward, knees bent, one hand to the ground. The jaws closed on the empty air above him. Roland grabbed Maylin around the waist and yanked her away. "Let me go!" screamed Maylin. "Father!" She howled as she struggled to extricate herself, determined to help her father. But someone else joined in, pulling her back several steps.
"Too big to fight up close,"
said a familiar voice behind her. Maylin whirled around. There was Shu, but this time she had no pack, and her back was not bent. She had a sharp chopstick in each hand, and they were bloody.
"Find bows, arrows."
Maylin looked around wildly. She couldn't see any unbroken bows or arrows, but she could see Jodaboda's lance, the end dug into the ground. She ran to it and pulled it out. It was heavy, but well balanced, and she was strong. Roland had found a bow. He was knocking an arrow too long for it, not very expertly. General Teng dodged another snap of the crocodile's jaws and struck back, causing more sparks to fly, but seemingly doing little else. "Help me now, Ji," whispered Maylin. She balanced the lance on her shoulder, gripping it with both hands, and bent her knees, ready to throw it at the crocodile's nearest eye. "It's just like a really sharp piece of bamboo." Strength and calm flooded into her. She could feel Roland and Shu at her back, and hear Rebecca and Connor running closer, calling. Maylin ignored them all, and took a deep breath, balancing carefully on both feet, the lance poised over her right shoulder, every muscle tensed and ready. At that moment, General Teng slipped on the bloody grass. He recovered almost instantly, bringing up his sword, but not fast enough. The crocodile's jaws closed powerfully around his body, massive teeth grinding against his armor. He grimaced in terrible pain, but made no sound at all. The sword fell from his hand as he was spat out onto the ground. Zhongyi's warriors never cried out in pain. Neither did General Teng or Maylin, even as the moment of stillness Ji had given her crumbled under the terrible shock of seeing her father struck down. She chose to act rather than scream. Putting aside all thought of throwing the lance, Maylin charged. "Maylin, no!" Roland was too slow to stop her. So was the crocodile. It swung its head around to catch the lance in its jaws, but the attempt came too late. The lance struck the corner of its mouth, just above the lip. Driven with all of Maylin's strength, as augmented by the great beast Ji, the steel lance head drove deep into the crocodile's jaw, inflicting a grievous wound, but not a mortal one. The crocodile opened its jaws to bite the impudent human who had hurt it so, only to receive Roland's arrow straight down its gullet. This also was only an annoyance, but its rider saw other archers running up, more green cloaks with unnatural strength and accuracy. The crocodile reared up, controlled by the armoured man on its back.
"We will conquer,"
hissed the crocodile's rider. But his actions belied the threat. The crocodile turned and streaked away with astonishing speed, crashing through friends and foes alike. At that moment, the conquerors lost the battle. Seeing their general and his great mount retreat, they turned tail and began to flee. Rhino riders ran them down, and the Zhongyi's gongs began to beat out their shrill command. Pursue, pursue, pursue. Mei Lin was aware of this only as a distant distraction. She ran to her father and knelt by his side. Blood bubbled from his lips. Impossibly, despite the crushing force of the crocodile's jaws and its huge teeth, the general was still alive. "Ji! Ji!" she called. The panda pressed in beside her and put one paw on her father's shattered chest. Ji pressed lightly, then retreated. "No," called Mei Lin, reaching out to pull the panda back. "Help him!" Ji did not budge. She sat where she was, her stillness indicating there was nothing she could do. "Mei Lin." It was the merest whisper. Mei Lin put her cheek against her father's, tears trickling down her face. "Father, I am here." "I am proud of you, daughter." The words were faint, barely audible over the clash of arms on the battlefield. "Should have told you. Betrayed the bile." He said no more. Mei Lin felt her father's face go slack under her cheek. Rising up, she saw brown eyes just like her own, now staring up into an interminable nothing. The world around her became silent all at once. Mei Lin lost track of the battlefield. Everything was replaced by a soundless wail, the scream of death. It was so loud. How could they not all hear it? How did they not go mad from it? Mei Lin felt Roland put his hand on her shoulder, and Ji moved to gently nuzzle her ear. She didn't respond to either of them. Instead, she bent over her father and gave way to her tears. It was not true that a Zhongyi's soldier never cried. Essex, minus a few feathers, came to land nearby. Connor and Abeka arrived too, but they did not speak. Connor helped a semi-conscious Tariq up, and Abeka bent down to see if Lishay was still alive. Uraza nosed at the dead Josur and made a small, keening noise deep in her throat. Mei Lin rocked back and forth on her knees. She wanted nothing more than to fly like Essex up into the sky and far away from the battlefield. But duty remained, to Ji and the others, to all of Erdos. The dream of flying was just that, a dream. She wiped her eyes and stood up.
"The time of the bamboo flowering comes to all," said Shu. "It is the life we lead that matters."
Mei Lin nodded dumbly, unable to speak. The words were familiar. It was an ancient Zhongyi saying, but she had never had them said to her before. She and her father had come a long way from Jano Rion, thought Mei Lin. A very long way. Now he, at least, would never return. Tariq's hand came down heavily on her shoulder, offering support, even as the battered older green cloak took it from her as well. The battle had passed on, leaving a trail of dead, wounded and bereft in its wake. It was strangely quiet, now that all the fighting was in the distance, and moving steadily farther away.
"We've won,"
Roland said.
"For now,"
said Tariq. "Lishay's alive," called out Abeka, "but I can't rouse her."
"Do not try," said Shu to Abeka. "To lose a spirit animal is a little death. Some come back, many do not."
Tariq closed his eyes briefly, as though this was one thing he could not bear.
"So I guess I should go and get the talisman now?" said Roland. "I mean,
In case they come back and counterattack or whatever? What do you mean, go and get the talisman? Asked Connor. Yeah, that's right. I didn't tell you. It's in the temple. I found it before and, put it back, said Rolan. What? Exclaimed Connor and Abeka in unison. Dinesh said that was good. That's why he helped. He said if we won, we could have it. So...
I wondered why Dinesh came to our aid, said Tariq.
He bent his head to Rolan.
Truly, Rolan, there's more Greencloak in you than you acknowledge. I hope that you will choose to fully join us, after all.
Let's not get ahead of ourselves, said Rolan. Who would you have to lecture at about duty and honour if I just went and joined up?
We'll go get it with you. Malin spoke with a quiet voice. Her father's body lay broken at her feet. She wasn't ready to be separated from the others yet. They were all she had left. She held out her hand. Surprised, Rolan took it, and their eyes met. Connor and Abeka hesitated, then joined their hands too, and all four of them looked at each other. They were bloody and exhausted, but they had survived their first major battle against the Devourer. Together. G watched the proceedings with her silver eyes, and glanced slyly at Briggan. The wolf grinned, his tongue hanging out. Uraza sniffed and began to wash her bloodied paws. Essex, high overhead, issued a long, piercing cry. Chapter 22. Slate Elephant. Dinesh received them at the base of the tumble-down pyramid with his surviving priests. The great elephant, last seen bleeding from hundreds of small wounds, now appeared completely unharmed. He was also somewhat smaller. The priests wore their elephant heads again, and simple robes of grey, though many also sported bandages.
So you have won, said Dinesh, and you have come to claim the slate elephant.
We've come to ask for it, said Rolan diplomatically, and to thank you for your help, added Abeka.
I only did what was needed to make it a fair contest,
rumbled Dinesh.
Maybe a little more, given they had that huge cold lizard on their side.
Was it a great beast? Asked Connor. The crocodile, like our spirit animals were.
Oh, no, child, said Dinesh. We great beasts are siblings of a sort. Though it is long since I knew the doings of the others, we are all stewards of Erdos, to the last of us. Even Kovo and Garathon, in their folly. No other creatures, great as they may become, can ever become a great beast. Still, that spirit animal and its rider do bear a striking resemblance.
I am fairly sure that was General Gar, said Abeka, though I couldn't see his face.
There is no doubt now that the Devourer has returned, said Tariq gravely, as we feared. Whether he is the Devourer or not, you must go from here soon, said Dinesh. The conquerors have suffered a defeat, but there are many more of them coming. They have found or made a way through the great bamboo maze, and no part of Farsit Nang is safe. They will attack again, and soon. I myself will be seeking a quieter place to continue my contemplations. We'll go back with the rhino riders to begin with, if they will take us.
Tariq turned to Jodaboda, who stood with them, his legs splintered and his arm around the shoulders of one of his riders for support. His beard was filthy, and he wore the heavy chain of his fallen rhino around his neck, as a sign of mourning.
We will take you, said Jodaboda. The Zhongi's resistance, too. We've decided we will fight the conquerors together in Farsit Nang, just as you have counselled all this time, old mother, he added to Shu. As always, you have gotten your way.
You mean
You found your good sense, said Shu with a snort.
Thanks from us, too, said Roland to Jodabodda. We would have been lost without the rhinos, and Maylin's father, and your priests too, Dinesh.
All were needed,
said Dinesh with a heavy sigh, as though resigning himself to a loss no less painful than Maylin's.
And all did what was needful. Go get the talisman. It is yours to wield now.
Roland sketched a hasty but sincere bow and went off at a run to climb the higgledy-piggledy steps of the pyramid, Essex flying in loops over his head. When he returned, it was to silence, the silence of exhaustion. They had won a battle and gained the slate elephant, but it was at a terrible cost. What would the quest for the next talisman demand of them?
Whose talisman will you seek next?
Asked Dinesh.
What great beast will have their solitude pierced by your grasping little voices? We do not know,
said Tariq. Unless you want to help us again, said Abeka. You mentioned something about Suka being entombed in ice. Where was that exactly? Dinesh laughed, a deep rumble that echoed across the crater.
Somewhere cold,
he said, his eyes twinkling.
I can say no more. Somewhere very cold.
That'll make a welcome change,
said Roland, holding up the chain with the slate elephant, slowly circling on the end for all to see.
I've got it. Just don't give it away, said Connor.
Roland was unsure for a moment whether Connor was joking or not. But of course he was. He had to be.
We've done that,
Roland said.
Let's not make that our thing.
Uraza suddenly growled and hissed at something behind them. Everyone turned to look. Lishay was lying on a stretcher nearby. Her wounds had been tended, but she still had not woken. Her cheeks were hollow, and her long hair was unbound. Now, a tiger with black stripes was sitting by Lishay's head, making mewling noises and batting at her face with a velvet paw. The claws retracted. Uraza started forward, but Abeka raised her hand, and the leopard stopped. Roland watched in wonder. The black tiger let out a mournful yowl and began to lick Lishay's cheek. The green cloak turned her head and mumbled something, throwing out her arm, the fingers lightly grasping the fur on the tiger's back. "Chasseur?" she said, slightly raising her head. Her eyes opened, and she saw her slain twin brother's spirit animal. "Jamin?" The tiger purred and bent his head. Lishay sobbed and wrapped her arms around the tiger, which promptly vanished in a flash of light. Lishay slowly pushed up her right sleeve, and then her left, staring at the tattoos of leaping tigers, one on each forearm. The left one was a white tiger, but it was faded, as if made by a ghost. The other, vibrant and new, showed a tiger as black as a starless night.
"Never seen that before," said Shu.